Elizabeth Carter pressed her veil against her face with trembling hands, not from fear, but from rage she had carried for 7 years. The church was full. Every seat taken by people who had whispered her name like a curse, who had crossed the street to avoid her shadow. And at the altar stood Nathaniel Whitmore, the most arrogant man in all of Virginia, who believed he was purchasing a broken woman along with her fortune. He had no idea he was walking straight into the trap she had spent a lifetime building. If this story already has you gripping your seat, subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning of her wedding, Elizabeth Carter did not cry. She sat at the edge of her bed in the gray light before dawn, hands folded in her lap, spine straight, and listened to the house breathe around her. The maids moved quietly through the hallway. She could hear their whispers through the door, low, careful, the kind of whispers people use when they are not sure whether the person on the other side is dangerous. She had worked very hard to make them unsure. 7 years ago, Elizabeth Carter had been a 17-year-old girl with her father's bright eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and a future that felt as wide as the Virginia sky in August. Her father, Thomas Carter, had been one of the most respected merchants in the county. Not the richest, not the most powerful, but honest, steady, the kind of man whose word was worth more than a written contract in 3 counties. That was before the Whitmore family. Before Harlan Whitmore, Nathaniel's father, had decided that Carter's shipping contracts were too valuable to leave in the hands of a man he could not control. Before the forged documents, before the false debts, before Harlan Whitmore's lawyers had descended on Carter Trading Company like a plague of locusts and stripped it to the bone in less than a season. Her father had died believing he had failed her. Elizabeth had spent 7 years making sure that failure became the last mistake the Whitmore family would ever celebrate. She rose from the bed, crossed to the mirror, looked at herself for a long moment, the dark eyes, the sharp cheekbones, the unsmiling mouth. And then she lifted the veil and pinned it carefully into place. No one in this county had seen her face in years. She intended to keep it that way for exactly 2 more hours. The Church of Harrow County held 400 souls on a generous Sunday. On the morning of July the 12th, 1817, it held every single one of them, plus a number of people who had ridden in from neighboring towns just to witness the spectacle. Nathaniel Whitmore was marrying the Carter woman, the monster, they called her. Not to her face. No one had seen her face long enough to say anything to it, but in parlors and on street corners and over fences between neighbors. The woman who wore a veil in high summer. The woman whose household staff turned over twice a year because nobody stayed long enough to find out why they'd been afraid to leave. The woman who had, in 7 years, quietly absorbed 3 failing businesses, 1 bankrupt textile mill, and a tobacco warehouse that had somehow gone from ruin to profit inside of 14 months. Strange, people said. Unnatural, some suggested. Cursed, the bolder ones whispered. Elizabeth had planted every single one of those rumors with the precision of a woman who understood that fear was the most reliable fence a woman could build around herself in a world where men owned everything and women owned only their reputations. She had chosen to own something else. Nathaniel Whitmore stood at the altar with the expression of a man attending his own funeral. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had once been considered handsome before too many years of pride and financial worry had set his jaw too hard and his eyes too cold. He was 35 years old. He had inherited a name, a crumbling estate, and a debt his father had spent 20 years pretending did not exist. The Whitmore land was dying. The fields needed drainage work that hadn't been done in a decade. The main house roof had been leaking since the spring of 1814. 3 of his tenant farmers had left last winter for Kentucky, and 2 more were talking about following them. His credit in town was still good. The name still carried that much. But it would not carry it much longer. He needed money. Elizabeth Carter had money. That was the entirety of Nathaniel Whitmore's romantic calculation on the morning of his wedding. His friend and attorney, George Aldrin, had stood beside him in the vestibule 20 minutes before the ceremony and said, with the careful diplomacy of a man delivering terrible news, "Nathaniel, I want you to know that I advised against this." "You've advised against everything I've done for 15 years, George. And I've been right every time. You were wrong about the tobacco futures in 14. I was right about your father's shipping deal." Nathaniel had said nothing to that. His father's shipping deal was not a subject either of them revisited willingly. "She is not what you think she is," George said. "She's a woman with money. That's all I need her to be. She is a woman who has been building something for 7 years, and I do not believe the thing she has been building is a comfortable home life for some landowner who needs his bills paid." "You're being dramatic." "Nathaniel." George lowered his voice. "Carter Trading Company. Do you remember what happened to it?" The silence lasted a beat too long. "My father made a business decision," Nathaniel said. "Your father destroyed a good man." "My father is dead," George said simply. "And you are here. And that woman," he nodded toward the closed church doors, "is Thomas Carter's daughter. And I would ask you, very sincerely, to consider what that might mean before you place a ring on her finger." Nathaniel straightened his coat. "Get your seat, George." George got his seat, but he did not stop watching the doors. The procession was quiet. No one expected a bride who had hidden her face for 7 years to make a joyful entrance, and Elizabeth did not disappoint them. She walked the aisle alone. Her stepfather, Samuel Hayes, had offered his arm, and she had kissed his cheek and told him she'd walk on her own. "Thank you," with her spine straight and her veil down and her hands steady at her sides. She did not carry flowers. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Nathaniel Whitmore, and she walked toward him like a woman who had already won something and was simply arriving to collect it. Nathaniel watched her come. He had expected. He did not know what he had expected. Something hunched, perhaps. Something apologetic. A woman made small by years of being called a monster, shuffling toward a marriage she needed as much as he did. This woman did not walk like that. She walked like she owned the floor beneath her feet. Interesting, he thought, despite himself. Then immediately reminded himself that interesting was not the point. The ceremony was brief. The minister was nervous. He stumbled twice over the words, and the congregation watched in the total silence of people who are too fascinated to remember they should pretend otherwise. The vows were exchanged. The ring was placed. The minister said the words he was obligated to say. "You may now—" "I know," Elizabeth said quietly. She reached up, both hands, steady as stone. She lifted the veil. The church went absolutely silent. Not the polite silence of ceremony. The stunned silence of 200 people discovering, simultaneously, that the story they had been telling themselves for 7 years was entirely wrong. Elizabeth Carter was not disfigured. She was not monstrous. She was. The only word that came to George Aldrin's mind, sitting in the third pew, was formidable. Dark eyes that missed nothing. A face built for neither softness nor cruelty, but for something harder and more durable than either. The kind of face that did not ask for your approval and would not mourn its absence. She was looking directly at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking directly at her. Something moved across his expression, too fast for the congregation to catch, but George caught it, because George had known Nathaniel Whitmore for 30 years and had learned to read the small earthquakes beneath the stone face. It was not attraction, exactly. It was not fear, exactly. It was the look of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath him is not the ground he thought he was standing on. "Mr. Whitmore," Elizabeth said. Her voice was low and clear and carried to every corner of that church without effort. "I believe we are married." "We are," Nathaniel said. "Good." She lowered her hands. "Then we have a great deal to discuss." The wedding dinner was held at Whitmore Hall, Nathaniel's estate, such as it was, and it was a more subdued affair than most wedding dinners in Virginia in the summer of 1817, which was saying something, because Virginia wedding dinners were rarely celebrations of unrestrained joy to begin with. Elizabeth sat at the head of the table at Nathaniel's right hand and ate with the focused efficiency of a woman who viewed the meal as a task to be completed. She spoke when spoken to. She did not volunteer warmth, but she did not volunteer coldness either. She was simply present, watchful, absolutely unreadable. Nathaniel watched her the way you watch something you cannot quite classify. After the guests had gone, and the last servant had been dismissed for the evening, they sat alone in the parlor for the first time, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable so much as heavily weighted, the way air gets before a storm. It was Nathaniel who spoke first. "You're not what I expected." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "I imagine I'm not." "You're going to tell me that's my fault for having expectations." "I wasn't going to say anything of the kind. I don't have time for lectures. I have work to do." He studied her. "What sort of work?" She reached into the small bag she had carried through the entire evening. He had noticed it and dismissed it as some feminine affectation, and drew out a folded document. She set it on the table between them and pushed it toward him with 2 fingers. He looked at it. He did not pick it up. "What is this?" "A full accounting of Whitmore Hall's current debt obligations," Elizabeth said. "Every creditor, every outstanding balance, every loan that your father took against this property over the past 20 years, and that you have been very carefully not looking at directly." The silence that followed was the kind that has edges. "You had no right," he started. "I had every right," she said, without heat, without apology. "I am now your wife. This estate is now, legally, my concern as much as yours. And I am telling you, Mr. Whitmore, that if someone does not address these obligations within the next 2 years, there will be no Whitmore Hall. There will be a property auction and a family name that means nothing, and everything your father built, however he built it, will be gone." Nathaniel stared at her. "You knew this before you agreed to marry me," he said. "Yes." "Then why?" "Because I want to fix it," she said. And something in her voice shifted. Not softened exactly, but changed, like a key turning in a lock. "Not for you, not for your name. I want to fix it because this land has good tenant farmers and good workers who deserve better management than they've received, and because I am very good at fixing things, and because—" She stopped. "Because why?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "Because your father took something from mine," she said. "And I intend to build it back. Here, on land that owes my family a debt it cannot pay any other way." The silence after that was very long. "You want revenge," Nathaniel said at last. "I want restitution," Elizabeth corrected. "There's a difference. Revenge leaves nothing standing. Restitution builds something new." She folded her hands on the table. "You can fight me on this, Mr. Whitmore. Many men would. Or you can step aside and let me work, and in 5 years this estate will be worth 3 times what it is now. Your workers will have roofs over their heads, and your family name will mean something again. Not because of what your father did, but because of what we do with what he left." Nathaniel said nothing. "Think about it," Elizabeth said. She rose from the table, picked up her bag, and walked toward the door. "I'll be in the East Wing. I've already had my things moved in. We can continue this conversation in the morning." "Elizabeth." She stopped, did not turn. "Why the veil?" he asked. "If there was nothing wrong with your face, and there clearly is not, why the veil for 7 years?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because men are less afraid of a woman they cannot see," she said, "and more afraid of a woman they can. I wanted to be the thing they couldn't see clearly. It was safer." A pause. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." She left. Nathaniel sat alone at the table for a long time, looking at the accounting document she had left behind. Eventually, with the reluctant movement of a man who already suspects the answer will make his evening worse, he picked it up and began to read. He read for 2 hours. When he finished, he set it down and sat in the dark for a while longer. George had been right. I was not sure, precisely, what he had walked into. But it was not what he had planned. Samuel Hayes found Elizabeth in the East Wing study at 10:30 that night. He was a wide, weathered man in his late 50s, with the hands of someone who had worked for everything he had, and the eyes of someone who had seen a great deal of working come to nothing through no fault of his own. He had been Thomas Carter's oldest friend and Elizabeth's closest ally, and he was the only person in the world she did not put on a performance for. He sat down in the chair across from her without being invited and said, "How'd it go?" He read the documents. "Did he throw them back at you?" "No." Samuel nodded slowly. "That's something." "He's proud," Elizabeth said. "He'll push back. He'll try to reassert control in ways that make him feel like this was his idea." "Let him, a little." "I know. You can't go to war with him every day, Eliza. You'll exhaust yourself before the work even starts." She looked up from the ledger in front of her. "I'm not trying to go to war with him." "No," Samuel said, watching her carefully. "But you are trying to punish him." "I'm trying to—" "Restitution," he said, with the gentle precision of a man who has heard this word many times. "I know what you call it. I also know what it looks like from the outside." He leaned forward. "He is not his father, Eliza. His father's choices are living in those fields right now," she said. "In those tenant houses, in those drainage ditches that haven't been maintained in 8 years. The men who work that land are paying for what Harlan Whitmore did. So am I. So is every person my father employed who had to find work elsewhere when his company collapsed." She set her pen down. "I don't hate Nathaniel Whitmore. I don't even particularly dislike him. But I am not going to pretend that his family owes nothing, because they owe everything, and I intend to collect it. Not in money, not in punishment, but in work, in change, in something better than what they built." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "He going to cooperate with that?" he asked. "I don't know yet." "What do you need from me?" "Come by Thursday. Bring the assessments on the South Fields, and the mill contracts." "Done." He pushed himself to his feet. "You eaten anything today?" "This morning." He looked at her the way a man looks at someone he raised. "I'll have the kitchen send something up." "You don't have to." "I'm not asking," he said. He left. Elizabeth sat alone in the lamplight, the ledger open in front of her, and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Her house now, as much as his. And felt, for the first time in 7 years, something complicated moving in her chest that was not purely anger. She pressed it flat and went back to work. Nathaniel could not sleep. He was a man who had always slept without difficulty. It was one of the advantages, he had always believed, of not examining things too closely. And the fact of lying awake in his own bed in his own house, while a woman he had married 6 hours ago worked in his study by lamplight, was deeply, specifically irritating. He thought about what she had said. "Your father took something from mine." He knew, in the abstract way that people know inconvenient truths they have decided not to sit with directly, what his father had done to Carter Trading Company. He knew that Harlan Whitmore had used his connections with the county magistrate to tie up Thomas Carter's shipping licenses in legal proceedings until the business simply could not sustain itself. He knew that documents had been involved. He had never asked what kind. He had been 19 years old. He had not asked questions. He had told himself, for 16 years, that he did not know what had happened. That his father was a hard man, but not a dishonest one. That the Carter business had simply failed, as businesses sometimes did. Tonight, in the dark, with 2 hours of accounting documents fresh in his memory and his wife working in the East Wing, he found that he did not entirely believe himself anymore. "Your father took something from mine. I intend to build it back." He turned over, stared at the ceiling. He thought about the way she had walked down that aisle. The way she had lifted her own veil without waiting for anyone's permission. The way she had said, "I believe we are married," in that packed, silent church, as if she were concluding a business meeting she had already won. He thought about those eyes. He had expected to feel contempt for this woman, or at best a kind of remote tolerance. He had not expected to find her interesting. He resented finding her interesting. It complicated the clean, simple story he had told himself about this marriage. Money for name, contract signed, problem solved. And Nathaniel Whitmore's life ran considerably more smoothly when the stories he told himself stayed clean and simple. He got up. He would not go to the East Wing. He was not going to give her the satisfaction of thinking she had unsettled him. But he walked to the window and stood in the dark, looking out at the summer fields, and for the first time in a long time, He thought about his father. Really thought about him. Not the cleaned-up version he kept in his memory, but the actual man. The one who had held this estate and these fields and these tenant farmers' lives in his hands, and had used every one of them as currency without once appearing to lose sleep over it. Is that what I'm doing? He had married Elizabeth Carter for her money. He had not asked how she had earned it. He had not asked what she had given up to build it. He had looked at the figure in the ledger and seen salvation and married a woman he did not know and told himself it was practical. His father had called himself practical too. Nathaniel stood at the window for a long time. In the east wing, a lamp was still burning. At breakfast the next morning, they sat across from each other over eggs and coffee and the comfortable Virginia summer sounds coming through the open windows, and Nathaniel looked at his wife and said, "Show me the South Fields." Elizabeth set down her coffee cup. "When?" she asked. "Now, this morning." She studied him for a moment with those dark eyes that seemed to measure and file away everything they saw. All right, she said. "Finish your coffee first." "I don't need—" "Finish your coffee," she said again. Not unkindly, but firmly. The tone of a woman who has already decided how the morning will go. "The fields will wait 20 minutes." He finished his coffee. They went out to the South Fields together, walking side by side in the summer heat, and Elizabeth showed him what the years of neglect had cost. The drainage ditches choked with sediment, the soil compacted from overcultivation without rotation, the fences that hadn't been properly maintained, the 2 tenant houses where 4 families were living in conditions that made Nathaniel's jaw tighten in a way he did not expect. She did not lecture him. She simply pointed and named and explained, with the precision of a woman who had studied this land more carefully than he had studied it himself. His own land, his family's land. And she did it without cruelty, without triumph, with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. That was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. "Who assessed this?" he asked at one point. "Samuel Hayes. He came out in May." "You were planning this in May." "I was planning this 4 years ago," she said. "I've been waiting until the debt reached a point where you would be willing to accept help." He stopped walking. She stopped too, and looked at him with a patience that was not indulgent. It was simply the patience of a person who has more time than you think and knows it. "That's a cold thing," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." "You waited until I was desperate." "I waited until you were ready to do what needs doing," she said. "Desperate men and ready men look the same from the outside sometimes. I was hoping you were the second kind." A pause. "Are you?" she asked. The sun was coming down hard on the fields. One of the tenant farmers, a man named Jeb Holloway, who had worked this land for 20 years, was watching them from the fence line with the careful blankness of a man who has learned not to show too much to the people who own his livelihood. Nathaniel looked at Jeb Holloway. Thought about what it had cost that man to stay when 3 of his neighbors had gone. "Yes," he said. "I think I am." Elizabeth nodded. No triumph, no smile. Just a small, careful nod, as if a thing had been confirmed that she had been fairly sure about, but was glad to have confirmed. "Good," she said. "Then let's start with the drainage." The drainage work started on a Monday. Nathaniel had expected Elizabeth to manage it from a distance, to send Samuel Hayes with instructions and ledger projections and let the men figure it out. That was how his father had run things. That was how every landowner he had ever known ran things. You gave the order, and the order got carried out, and you did not dirty your boots in the process. Elizabeth was in the south field at 6 in the morning, with mud on her hem, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. Jeb Holloway saw her first. He had been with 4 other tenant farmers, waiting for the day's direction, and when Elizabeth Carter, Mrs. Whitmore now, though the name still sat oddly on people's tongues, came walking out to meet them with Samuel Hayes at her side and a set of drainage maps in her hand, Jeb took off his hat without thinking about it. The other men followed a half-second behind him. "Morning, ma'am," Jeb said. "Good morning, Mr. Holloway." She looked at the maps, then at the field, then back at the maps. "We're going to start at the northeast corner and work our way down. Mr. Hayes is going to walk you through the channel plan. I want the first section cleared before the heat gets up." "Yes, ma'am." She handed the maps to Samuel and turned to go back to the house. Jeb watched her go. Then he looked at Samuel Hayes and said quietly, "She always likes that." Samuel put on his hat. "Like what?" "Like she already knows how everything's going to go." Samuel allowed himself a small smile. "Pretty much," he said. "You'll get used to it." Jeb glanced toward the house, where Elizabeth had gone back through the door without looking back. "Yes, sir," he said slowly. "I believe I will." Nathaniel had been watching from the fence line. He had not been invited, and he had not asked. He had simply gotten up early and walked out and stood there, and he had seen the whole exchange, the way the men responded to her, the way she moved through the morning with that absolute unsentimental competence. And he had felt something he did not immediately have a name for. It was not admiration exactly. It was the specific discomfort of a man who has been raised to believe that authority flows in one direction, discovering that he has been wrong about this for his entire adult life. He walked back to the house. He had his own work to do. The first week of their marriage established a pattern that neither of them had discussed, and neither of them broke. Nathaniel managed the business contacts, the merchants, the creditors, the county magistrate, the men who needed to see a Whitmore name on a letter before they would take a letter seriously. Elizabeth managed everything else: the fields, the accounts, the tenant farmers, the household staff, who had begun, cautiously, to test the edges of what this new mistress expected and had discovered, cautiously, that she expected a great deal and yelled about nothing and paid on time. Within 2 weeks, 3 of the household staff who had been planning to leave had decided to stay. Nathaniel found this out from his housekeeper, a woman named Ruth Cantor, who had been with the estate for 11 years and whose loyalty was to the land rather than to any particular family that happened to be standing on it. She asked everyone their name, Ruth told him, in the tone of someone reporting a miracle. On her second day, sat down in the kitchen and asked every person who worked here their name and what they did and whether they had any concerns about the estate. Did they tell her? Ruth looked at him with the patience of a woman who has been managing a house while men asked the wrong questions for 11 years. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "when someone in charge asks your name and actually waits for the answer, you tell them everything." Nathaniel spent a few seconds with that. What did she do with what they told her? "Fix 2 of the things that very afternoon," Ruth said, "and wrote the rest down." She paused. "She writes everything down." He had noticed that. Elizabeth's study, the East Wing, had become definitively her territory within 48 hours of their wedding. A fact he had accepted with less resentment than he expected, was becoming a landscape of organized documents, correspondence, and ledger books that she moved through with the ease of someone who had built the system and could navigate it blindfolded. He knocked on the open door that Tuesday evening. She looked up from her writing. "I had a letter from James Aldrin today," he said. "George's brother?" "He's on the county land board. He's asking about the mill contract." Elizabeth set her pen down. "The Harrow Mill contract? You know it?" "I've been looking at it for 2 years. It's underperforming by about 40%. She stood up, moved to one of the organized stacks on the side table, and produced a document with a certainty that told him she knew exactly where everything was. "Come in." He stepped into the study. She spread the document on the table, and he came to stand beside her, close enough to see the figures, and for a moment they were simply 2 people looking at numbers together, and the strange, almost ease of that was something he noticed and immediately set aside. "The mill's problem isn't the equipment," Elizabeth said, pointing to a column. "It's the supply chain. They're buying raw materials from a middleman who is taking a margin that makes no sense given the alternatives. If you renegotiate directly with the Caldwell suppliers in Richmond..." "The Caldwells won't deal with Whitmore," Nathaniel said. She looked up at him. "Why not?" He was quiet for a beat. "My father had a disagreement with Edward Caldwell." "What kind of disagreement?" "The kind that ended with Caldwell losing his Richmond warehouse lease." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "And your father was responsible for that?" "My father..." He stopped, started again. "Yes." "All right," she said. She did not lecture him. She turned back to the document. Then we approach them differently. I have a relationship with their daughter-in-law's family. We can come in through that connection instead of the Whitmore name. You have a relationship with... I've spent 7 years building relationships, Elizabeth said, without looking up. It seemed prudent, given that the Whitmore name was going to continue being difficult to use directly for some time. He stared at her. You planned for this, he said. Specifically this. The Caldwells. I planned for most things, she said, still reading the document. How many things? He asked. She looked up then, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite amusement, but lived in the same neighborhood. Enough, she said. He looked at her for a moment. This woman he had married for money, who had apparently spent 7 years building a chess game, and recently concluded that he was the last piece she needed. And he felt again that complicated, uncomfortable thing that he still did not have a proper name for. Elizabeth, he said. Yes. Are you ever going to tell me the full plan? Or are you going to continue showing it to me one piece at a time? She considered this. Probably one piece at a time, she said. You seem to absorb it better that way. He should have been offended. He was, a little. But there was something so plainly pragmatic about the observation. She was not trying to diminish him. She was simply accurate. That the offense didn't quite take hold. Fair enough, he said, after a moment. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He went back to his own side of the house and thought about Edward Caldwell's warehouse for longer than was strictly necessary. It was Jeb Holloway's wife, Clara, who first made Elizabeth Carter feel something she had not felt in a long time. Clara Holloway was a small, direct woman in her 40s who brought lunch to the field crew on Thursdays and who had, on the third Thursday, brought an extra plate to the East Wing study without being asked and set it on the table next to Elizabeth's papers. You didn't eat this morning, Clara said. Elizabeth looked up. How do you know that? Ruth told me, and before that, you didn't eat the evening before either. Clara sat down across from her with the comfort of a woman who decides for herself what she is welcome. I'm not trying to mind your business, Mrs. Whitmore, but we're about to head into 6 weeks of hard work on this land, and we need you sharp. We need you. Elizabeth had not heard those words arranged in that order in a very long time. Thank you, Mrs. Holloway, she said. Clara. Elizabeth looked at the plate, picked up the fork. How long have you been on this land? 22 years, Clara said. Since before Jeb and me were married. My father worked these fields for old Harlan Whitmore. Elizabeth kept her face even. Was that a good situation for your family? Clara was quiet for a moment. Harlan Whitmore was a man who believed that other people existed to serve his convenience, she said, with the measured precision of someone who has chosen their words very carefully over many years. He was not cruel exactly, but he was not kind either. He was indifferent, which is sometimes worse. A pause. His son is different. Elizabeth looked up. Is he? She asked, careful. Nathaniel came out to the Dawson family's house last week, Clara said. You know about the Dawsons, over on the west edge? Their roof. That's right. It's been bad since spring. Nathaniel came out with 2 men, and they spent an afternoon fixing it. Clara tilted her head slightly. He didn't send someone. He went himself. Elizabeth said nothing. Jeb says he didn't say much the whole time, just worked. Clara folded her hands on the table. I'm not asking you to like your husband, Mrs. Whitmore. I don't know what happened between your families, and I don't imagine it was simple. But I'm telling you what I've seen, because I think it matters, and I think you're the kind of woman who wants to know things that matter. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Thank you, Clara. Clara stood up. Eat the food, she said. The chicken's good today. She left. Elizabeth ate the food. She thought about Nathaniel Whitmore spending an afternoon fixing a tenant farmer's roof without saying much. She pressed the thought flat, the same way she pressed everything flat, the same efficient internal motion she had been using for 7 years to keep things from becoming complicated. It was getting harder to do. The argument happened on a Friday evening, 16 days into the marriage. It had been built. Nathaniel recognized afterward, for the better part of a week, the slow accumulation of small resistances on his part and small immovabilities on hers. The friction of two people who were both accustomed to making decisions alone, suddenly having to share the same operational space. It started with the Hendricks contract. A merchant named Paul Hendricks had been supplying the estate with equipment and goods for 11 years, since Nathaniel's father had set up the arrangement. The prices were worse than market rate by a significant margin. Elizabeth had found a better supplier and had, without consulting Nathaniel, sent a letter ending the Hendricks arrangement effective the following month. Nathaniel found out from Paul Hendricks himself, who came to the estate in person, red-faced and furious, and said, "Your wife sent me a termination letter, Nathaniel. Your wife." He had managed that conversation. He had said the appropriate things and shown Paul Hendricks the door with his dignity, at least partially intact, and had then walked directly to the east wing and knocked on the door with more force than was strictly necessary. "Come in," Elizabeth said. He came in. She was at her desk. She looked up, read his face in about a second, and set down her pen. "Hendricks came in person," she said. It was not a question. "You should have told me," Nathaniel said. "Before you sent that letter, you should have consulted me." "The Hendricks arrangement was costing us $40 a month more than it needed to," Elizabeth said. "I've been tracking it for 3 weeks. The alternative supplier is reliable and significantly cheaper. That is not the point." "I know it's not the point," she said. "The point is that Paul Hendricks has been your family's supplier for 11 years, and you have feelings about that, and I should have understood that before acting unilaterally." She paused. "I'm telling you that I understand that now." He blinked. He had prepared himself, quite thoroughly, for a fight. For Elizabeth to tell him that the numbers spoke for themselves and sentiment was not a sound business strategy. He had not prepared himself for a direct, unapologetic acknowledgement that she had misjudged the situation. "You're admitting you were wrong?" he said. "I'm admitting I was incomplete," she said. "I was right about the numbers. I was wrong not to bring you in before acting." She met his eyes. "This is your estate, Nathaniel. I know what I'm here to do, and I know how to do it. But it is your estate and your name and your relationships in this county, and I should not be making moves that affect those things without you." He stood there for a moment. "Why are you being reasonable about this?" he said. "I came in here ready to fight," she said. "I know. I've been watching you build toward it all week." She tilted her head slightly. "I've been building toward it too, if I'm being honest. I've been managing things in a way that doesn't leave much room for you to feel useful, and I think that's been deliberate on my part, and I think it's not helping either of us." The frankness of this landed somewhere he hadn't expected. "Why?" he said. "Why deliberate?" She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since their wedding day, something moved across her face that was not calculation or efficiency, or that focused, forward-aimed competence. Something older and more unguarded, something she pulled back almost as soon as it appeared. "Because it's easier to work alone," she said. "I've been doing it for 7 years. People who work alone don't get—" She stopped. "Don't get what?" She picked up her pen. "Don't get surprised," she said. The room was very quiet. "Elizabeth," he said, and his voice came out differently than he intended. Quieter, and without the edge he'd walked in with. "We should create a system," she said, "back to business, efficient and forward-moving. A weekly conversation. What you're managing, what I'm managing, anything that intersects gets discussed before any action is taken. Does that work for you?" He looked at her. The straight back, the pen already moving again. The door she had opened for 2 seconds and closed with practiced precision. And he thought about what she had almost said. "Don't get surprised." "That works," he said. "Good." She was already writing. "Same time next week, Friday evening." He left. He stood in the hallway for a moment and thought about a woman who had spent 7 years engineering a situation so thoroughly that she never had to be surprised by anything, and who had just, in a conversation about a merchant's contract, let him see the edge of something she had been keeping very carefully hidden. He went to bed that night and slept badly again. And this time, he did not tell himself it was irritation. The weekly meeting became the clearest window either of them had into the other. They were formal, at first, agenda-driven, numbers-focused, the two of them across the desk with documents between them as a kind of buffer. But things have the way of softening with repetition, and by the third Friday, the documents were still there, but the formality had worn slightly at the edges. "The Caldwell connection came through," Elizabeth said, on the third Friday. "How?" "Margaret Caldwell's sister-in-law is a client of Samuel's. I asked Samuel to mention that Whitmore Hall was under new management, and that we were looking to establish direct supplier relationships in Richmond." She allowed herself, briefly, the closest thing she had to satisfaction. "Edward Caldwell sent a letter this week." "You're serious," Nathaniel said. "I wants to meet in Richmond in September. He specifically said he was interested in speaking with the management of the estate." She paused. "He doesn't know that management is a woman, but we can address that when we get there." "How do you plan to address it?" "By having already been indispensable before he finds out," she said simply. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "You do that a lot," he said. "Do what?" "Make yourself indispensable before people realize they're relying on you." She considered this. "Yes," she said. "It's more reliable than asking for trust up front." "Has anyone ever simply trusted you up front?" he asked. Something shifted very briefly in her expression. "Samuel," she said. "My father." A pause. "Not many others." The weight of what she didn't say was larger than what she did. "I believed what everyone said about you," Nathaniel said. He said it without planning to, and he did not dress it up or soften it. "Before the wedding, I'd heard the rumors for years and I accepted them without question." He met her eyes. "That was a failure of character on my part, not evidence of yours." Elizabeth looked at him across the desk. She did not say thank you. She did not say I know. She simply looked at him for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes, and then she said, "The Caldwell meeting is September the 14th. "I'll be there," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will." And something in the way she said it, not challenging, not relieved, just certain, told him that this was a new kind of certainty. Not the certainty she'd had about the chess game. Something else. I thought about it for the rest of the evening and did not come to a conclusion. It was the night of the Harper social, 6 weeks into the marriage, that the county got its first real look at Nathaniel and Elizabeth Whitmore as a unit, and the county did not know what to make of what it saw. The Harpers were the second-ranking family in the county, which meant they hosted the most important social gatherings of the summer, with the slightly desperate energy of people who are determined not to be thought of as second. The invitation had arrived the week before, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, and Elizabeth had looked at it for a moment before setting it on the weekly agenda stack without comment. Nathaniel had noticed it there on Friday. "Are we going?" he asked. "That depends," she said. "On what?" "On whether you're prepared to present a united front to 30 people who are very curious about our marriage, and several of whom will be actively looking for cracks in it." "Why would they be looking for cracks?" Elizabeth looked at him with the patience she reserved for questions whose answers she considered self-evident. "Because we are interesting, Nathaniel. You are a landowner who married a woman everyone called a monster. I am a woman who has been building something in private for 7 years and just married into a family with a complicated history. Every person at that gathering is going to be watching us and drawing conclusions." She folded her hands. "So, are you prepared?" "What does prepared look like?" "It looks like you don't drink more than 2 glasses. It looks like we arrive together and leave together. It looks like if anyone says something unkind about me or my family, you respond before I do." She paused. "And it looks like you don't look surprised by anything I say or do, because if you look surprised, they'll know we're not a team." "Are we a team?" he asked. The question sat in the air between them. "We are becoming one," Elizabeth said, "whether we intended to or not." He thought about this. "All right," he said. "We'll go." The Harper gathering was exactly what Elizabeth had predicted. 30 people in a well-lit parlor, warm from the summer heat and from the specific excitement of social events that might produce gossip, and every one of them watching the door when Nathaniel and Elizabeth walked in together. The room shifted. It was subtle, but Nathaniel felt it. The slight recalibration of attention, the murmured conversations briefly pausing and then resuming at a slightly different pitch. He had walked into rooms all his life as a Whitmore and understood how to carry that. He had never walked in with someone, not really, not as a genuine half of something. He put his hand on the small of Elizabeth's back. She did not stiffen. She did not lean into it. She simply continued walking, exactly as she had been, and somehow the steadiness of that was its own kind of answer. Martha Harper reached them first, as hostess, with the bright, brittle smile of a woman who has been looking forward to this encounter since the invitation was sent. "Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore, we are so pleased you could join us." "Thank you for the invitation," Elizabeth said. We were just all so curious," Martha said, with the air of someone about to say something they know they shouldn't and have decided to say anyway. "You have kept yourself so private these past years, Mrs. Whitmore." "I've been busy," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "Yes, we've heard you've been reorganizing things at Whitmore Hall." "Improving things," Nathaniel said. He said it without inflection, but clearly, and Martha Harper's bright smile flickered for a half-second before resettling. "My wife has a considerable talent for it." Martha looked between them. How wonderful for you both," she said, and moved on. Elizabeth did not look at him, but he felt somehow that she had noted it. The way you note something you were not certain would happen and are quietly, carefully glad that it did. The evening had its difficulties. A man named Clive Dunmore, who had known Nathaniel's father and had the conversational instincts of someone who considered social events to be blood sport, found Elizabeth at the edge of the room and said, with a smile that was pure teeth, "Mrs. Whitmore, I must say, seeing your face after all these years is quite the occasion." "I imagine so," Elizabeth said. "We always wondered, you know, about the veil. People said, well, people say all sorts of things." "They do," she agreed. "Must have been quite a shock for your husband. On your wedding night." He said it with the specific, satisfied cruelty of a man who believes that embarrassing a woman is a form of wit. Nathaniel appeared at Elizabeth's side. He had come from across the room, and he came without haste, but with a directness that made Dunmore blink. "Clive," Nathaniel said. "Nathaniel, I was just telling your—" "I heard," Nathaniel said. His voice was entirely even. "My wife is not a subject for speculation, Clive. I'd take it as a courtesy if you remembered that." The silence that followed was small and complete. Dunmore recovered his smile. "Of course," he said. "Of course, I meant nothing by it." "Good," Nathaniel said. Dunmore retreated with what dignity he had left, which was considerably less than he had arrived with. Nathaniel and Elizabeth stood side by side for a moment. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know," he said. Another moment. "Thank you," she said. The word came out without its usual armor. Just the word, plain and direct, with something underneath it that was not efficiency. He nodded, once. They stayed another hour, and they left together, and neither of them said much on the ride home, but the silence was different from what it had been before. Less like two people being careful around each other, and more like two people who had, without exactly deciding to, moved a step closer to the same ground. It was Samuel Hayes who saw it first, because Samuel Hayes always saw things first. He came to the estate on the following Thursday with the Southfield assessment reports and found Elizabeth in the East Wing, and he sat down and watched her for a while in the way he'd been watching her since she was 12 years old, and he said, "Something's changed." Elizabeth did not look up from her writing. "The Caldwell meeting is confirmed." "That's not what I mean," she kept writing. "The drainage work is ahead of schedule." "Eliza." She set down her pen. She looked at him with the expression she reserved for the people who knew her well enough not to be managed. "Don't," she said. "I'm not saying anything," Samuel said, with the innocence of a man saying everything. I'm observing that you look different than you did 4 weeks ago. I'm sleeping better. You're also arguing less with me about whether you've eaten. I have a standing lunch situation on Thursdays now, she said. Clara Holloway. Samuel's expression did something warm and restrained. You made a friend. I made a working relationship with a tenant farmer's wife who had relevant operational insights. Eliza. Don't make it into something, Samuel. He leaned back in his chair. What about Whitmore? The pause before she answered was a half-second too long for a woman who answered everything immediately. He's cooperative, she said. He works hard. He's better with the tenant farmers than I expected him to be. Is that all? That's all I'm prepared to discuss, she said. Samuel looked at her for a long moment with those steady, experienced eyes that had watched her grow from a grieving girl into a formidable woman, and had never once stopped being afraid that the armor would grow too thick for anything to reach her. He defended you, Samuel said. At the Harper gathering, Jeb's wife told Clara, and Clara told me. Word travels fast. Always has. He paused. How did it feel? Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the window. The summer light was strong and golden, and the sounds from the south field were distant but steady. The sounds of work being done, of things being fixed. Strange, she said. It felt strange. Strange good or strange frightening? She picked up her pen. Both, she said, and started writing again. Samuel let it go. But on his way out, he passed Nathaniel in the hallway, and the two men exchanged the kind of look that communicates things precisely and without words. And Samuel Hayes walked to his horse with the first uncomplicated sense of hope he had felt about Elizabeth Carter's future in 7 years. The first time Nathaniel saw Elizabeth truly afraid, he almost missed it. It was late on a Tuesday evening, the kind of summer night that had gone thick and close with heat, and he had come downstairs for water and seen light under the east wing door and knocked without thinking. Come in, Elizabeth said. He came in. She was sitting at her desk with a letter in her hands, and she was very still in the way that things are still when they are holding themselves together by effort rather than ease. She looked up when he entered, and he saw, in the half-second before she reassembled herself, something he had not seen on her face before. Fear. Not the generalized wariness she wore like a working garment. Something specific and sharp and old. What is it? He asked. She set the letter down. A business matter. Elizabeth. She looked at him. Who's the letter from? He asked. A long pause. And then, with the precision of someone making a decision they had not planned to make. A man named Hargrove. Warren Hargrove. Nathaniel knew that name. Everyone in Virginia business circles knew that name. What does he want? Nathaniel asked. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was entirely even, but her hands on the desk were not. He wants a meeting, she said. He's been watching the activity on this estate, the new contracts, the Richmond connection. She paused. He says he has information about my father's business dealings that he believes I would find relevant. Nathaniel pulled up a chair and sat down without being invited. What kind of information? The kind that could be used, Elizabeth said carefully, either to help someone or to damage them, depending on who controls it and what they want from you in return. The weight of that landed precisely. He's threatening you, Nathaniel said. He's conducting an exploratory negotiation, Elizabeth said. He doesn't know yet whether he has leverage or information. He's testing to see which one I believe he has. Which does he have? She looked at him. And for a moment, the armor was not entirely in place, and he could see the thing underneath it. Not the plan, not the calculation, but the woman who had spent 7 years building walls high enough that nothing could reach her, looking at the possibility that she had miscalculated somewhere. I don't know yet, she said. It was, he realized, the first time she had said those words in the 6 weeks they had been married. Then we find out, he said. Together. She looked at him across the desk. This woman who trusted no one, and had planned everything, and had built her entire world on the certainty that she did not need anyone's help, and she did not argue. "Together," she said. Outside, the summer night was heavy and close, and full of the sounds of crickets and the far-off movement of the south field, and the work that was slowly, steadily turning something broken into something worth saving. Inside the east wing, in the lamplight, two people who had not planned on needing each other were beginning to discover what it meant that they did. The letter from Warren Hargrove sat on Elizabeth's desk for 3 days before she answered it, not because she didn't know what to say. Elizabeth Carter had always known what to say. She sat on it because for the first time in 7 years, she was making a decision that involved someone else's safety as well as her own, and she did not yet trust herself to do that without making a mistake. Nathaniel noticed she was sitting on it. He did not push. He simply continued showing up. At breakfast, at the weekly meeting, at the Southfield fence line, where he had taken to checking the drainage progress in the mornings. And he did not ask again what she planned to do about Hargrove, because he had the instincts of a man who has finally learned, late but genuinely, when to wait. On the third morning, Elizabeth came to breakfast and sat down across from him and said, "I'm going to write back to Hargrove." Nathaniel looked up from his coffee. "What are you going to say?" "That I'll meet with him, September the 3rd, in Richmond, neutral ground." "Not here," he said. "Not here," she agreed. "I don't want him in this house." He nodded once. "I'm coming with you." "Nathaniel, I'm coming with you," he said again, in the same tone, which was not commanding and not pleading, but simply certain, the way a man sounds when he has made up his mind and the decision does not feel optional to him. "That's not negotiable." She looked at him across the breakfast table, and he looked back at her, and the silence lasted about 5 seconds. And then Elizabeth picked up her fork and said, "Fine." It was, he would reflect later, the first time she had agreed to let him stand beside her without finding a way to manage him into a position slightly behind and to the left. The letter went out that afternoon. Warren Hargrove's reply arrived in 4 days. He was agreeable. September the 3rd was convenient. He looked forward to a productive conversation. He signed it with the kind of flowing, overconfident signature that belongs to men who believe their name is the most important thing in any room they enter. Elizabeth read it twice and handed it to Nathaniel. "He thinks this is already settled," Nathaniel said. "He always thinks that," Elizabeth said. "He's been operating in Virginia business for 20 years, and he's been right often enough that he's stopped questioning the assumption." "What does he actually have? On your father?" She was quiet for a moment. They were in the east wing, and the evening light was coming in warm, and the sounds of the summer had settled into the particular quiet that happens after a day of heavy work. "My father borrowed money in 1808, she said, "from a private lender, not Hargrove, a man named Putnam, who has since died. The loan was informal. There may be documents that make it appear like something it wasn't." She paused. "Or there may not be. That's what I don't know. What would it appear like, if the documents exist? Like my father had creditors he didn't disclose. Like the collapse of Carter Trading Company wasn't entirely the result of what the Whitmores did to the licensing contracts." She met his eyes. "Like my father had problems of his own that contributed to his failure." The room was very quiet. "Did he?" Nathaniel asked. "No," Elizabeth said. "But documents can be shaped to suggest things that aren't true. That's something your family's attorneys demonstrated thoroughly in 1809. The word landed between them with the precision of something thrown. Nathaniel held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "They did." She had expected him to flinch. He didn't. He held it, the same way he'd been holding every uncomfortable true thing she laid in front of him since the first night of their marriage, with the steadiness of a man who has decided that looking away is no longer something he's willing to do. "So Hargrove may have real documents, or manufactured ones, or nothing at all," Nathaniel said. "Correct. And we won't know which until we meet with him." "Correct. Then we go to Richmond," he said, "and we find out." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Samuel is coming too." "Obviously," Nathaniel said. She almost smiled. She was getting closer to actually smiling, he had noticed. The distance between almost and actually was narrowing by increments, the way all distances do when people spend enough time in honest company. 3 days before the Richmond meeting, Clive Dunmore came to Whitmore Hall uninvited. He arrived mid-morning, when Nathaniel was out at the north fence with Jeb Holloway going over the timber situation, and he presented himself at the front door and told Ruth Cantor that he had business with Mrs. Whitmore. Ruth came to find Elizabeth in the study. "Mr. Dunmore's at the door, ma'am." Elizabeth looked up from the Richmond correspondence. "Dunmore." "Yes, ma'am. He says he has business to discuss." She set her pen down slowly. She thought about the Harper gathering, about the specific satisfaction in Dunmore's voice when he'd said, "Must have been quite a shock for your husband," about the kind of man who considers another person's discomfort to be a form of entertainment. "Send him in," she said. Ruth's expression said a number of things that Ruth herself would not say aloud, and she went to send him in. Dunmore came in with the self-possessed ease of a man who does not question his welcome. He looked around the study with the frank curiosity of someone assessing an enemy's territory, taking in the organized stacks of documents, the ledger books, the Richmond correspondence on the desk. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you've made quite a command center here." "Sit down, Mr. Dunmore," Elizabeth said. He sat. "What can I do for you?" she asked. "I'll be direct," he said, which in Elizabeth's experience meant precisely the opposite. There is talk in the county about the changes you are making at Whitmore Hall." "What kind of talk?" "Concerned talk," he said. "Several of the men who have had long business relationships with this estate are unsettled by the pace and nature of the changes. The Hendricks situation, the new supplier arrangements, the fact that—" He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who wants his knife to land precisely. "The fact that it appears the estate is being operated primarily by a woman whose background and methods are not entirely transparent." Elizabeth looked at him. "Which men?" she asked. "I represent a number of—" "Which men?" she said again, just as pleasantly, just as still. Dunmore's ease shifted slightly. "James Aldrin, Paul Hendricks, Robert Kane." "James Aldrin is on the county land board," Elizabeth said. "Paul Hendricks is a former supplier we replaced because his pricing was not competitive. Robert Kane is Robert Kane, the man who tried to purchase the Holloway farmstead 2 years ago and was declined because the family held a long-standing lease." A short silence. "I believe so, yes." "So what you're telling me," Elizabeth said, "is that 3 men with direct financial interests in the previous management of this estate are concerned about the current management." She tilted her head. "Is that an accurate summary, Mr. Dunmore?" Dunmore's smile had gone somewhat rigid. "I'm telling you that there are people in this county with influence." "I know who has influence in this county," Elizabeth said. "I've been studying it for years." She folded her hands on the desk. "What is it that you actually came here to say?" He leaned forward. "I came to suggest, Mrs. Whitmore, that a woman in your position would be wise to move more carefully. The changes you are making are visible, and visibility invites scrutiny. And scrutiny, for a woman with your history, could become complicated." The threat in it was perfectly constructed, perfectly deniable. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you for your concern," she said. "I'll walk you out." He blinked. He had expected more: argument, or fear, or the satisfying sight of a woman recalibrating in the face of pressure. He had not expected to be walked to the door, but Elizabeth was already on her feet, and there was something in the way she moved, the complete absence of any hurry, the complete absence of any agitation, that left him without a good response. He stood. He followed her to the door. She opened it, and he stepped out, and she said, "Good day, Mr. Dunmore," with the warmth of a woman concluding a business meeting, and closed it. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went directly to find Ruth Cantor. "Who in the household has contact with Dunmore's staff?" she asked. Ruth considered. "Mary, the laundress. Her sister works in Dunmore's house." "I need to know what Dunmore's connection to Warren Hargrove looks like," Elizabeth said. "Not gossip. Anything concrete. Letters delivered, visits made, any business activity that links them. Ruth nodded with the practical efficiency of a woman who has understood for years that information is currency and has been collecting it quietly out of long habit. "I'll ask." "Thank you." Elizabeth went back to the East Wing and sat at her desk and looked at the Richmond correspondence and thought about 3 men with financial interests in the previous management of this estate and 1 social gadfly who had chosen to deliver their message in person. And she thought about the specific timing of this visit, 3 days before Richmond, and she felt the shape of something she had not quite seen before beginning to clarify. Hargrove was not operating alone. Nathaniel came in from the north fence at noon and found Elizabeth waiting for him in the front hall, which was not where Elizabeth usually was at noon, and his reading of her face, a skill he had been developing with some urgency over the past 2 months, told him immediately that something had happened. "Dunmore was here," she said. He stopped. "When?" "This morning, while you were out." "What did he want?" She told him. All of it. The implied threat, the 3 names, the specific timing. She told it plainly and quickly, the way she told everything, without ornamentation or appeal for sympathy, just the facts arranged in their correct order. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Aldrin, Hendricks, and Kane." "Yes." "And you think they're connected to Hargrove?" "I think Dunmore didn't come here on his own initiative," Elizabeth said. "He's not strategic enough to have constructed that visit himself. Someone told him what to say and when to say it." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. 3 days before Richmond." "Yes." "They're trying to unsettle you before the meeting." "They're trying to find out how easily I can be unsettled," she corrected. "There's a difference. If I had reacted to Dunmore with any visible anxiety, that information would have been in Hargrove's hands by evening." "Did you?" She looked at him. "No." He nodded. He had not really needed to ask. "So Hargrove, Dunmore, Aldrin, Hendricks, and Kane. That's a network. A small one, but yes." "What are they after?" "The estate," she said. "Or specifically, the contracts I've been building. The Caldwell connection. The Richmond access." She paused. "They watched this estate fail for 10 years because it was easier to deal with a Whitmore who needed favors than a Whitmore who didn't. A functioning, independent Whitmore Hall is bad for everyone who benefited from a struggling one." Nathaniel stood very still. "My father's arrangement with those men," he said slowly, "was profitable for everyone except the people who actually worked this land," Elizabeth said. She said it without cruelty, but she said it. "How long have you known this?" he asked. "Long enough." "Elizabeth." She met his eyes. 2 years, she said. "I've known the shape of it for 2 years. I didn't know all the names until Dunmore came in today and gave them to me." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a person is reassembling their understanding of something they thought they already understood. "They're going to come to Richmond," Nathaniel said. "Or they're going to have someone there," she said. "Yes." "Then we need to know before we walk in what Hargrove actually has," he said. "And we need George." Elizabeth blinked. It was the smallest possible expression of surprise, but he caught it. "Your attorney?" "He's been practicing in Virginia for 30 years, Nathaniel said. "He knows Hargrove, he knows Aldrin, and he told me 6 weeks ago that I didn't understand what I was walking into." He paused. He was right. I'd like to give him the satisfaction of knowing that and then use his help. Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. This man she had married for position and history, and the weight of a name she intended to make into something better. And she felt the thing she had been pressing flat for 2 months shift again in her chest, pressing back this time, refusing to be managed. "Bring George," she said. George Aldrin arrived the following afternoon and walked into the East Wing study and looked around at the organized system of documents and ledger books with the expression of a man seeing confirmation of something he had been fairly sure about. "You run a tighter operation than your husband," he told Elizabeth. "Most people do," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "Sit down, Mr. Aldrin." George sat. Nathaniel sat. Samuel Hayes, who had arrived that morning with the Richmond assessment materials and had not been asked to leave, sat in the corner with the quiet permanence of a man who has been in important rooms for 40 years and knows how to make himself part of the furniture. Elizabeth laid out what they knew. The Hargrove letter, Dunmore's visit, the 3 names, the timing. George listened with his hands folded and his expression grave and didn't interrupt once, which Elizabeth recognized as the mark of a man who already knew more than he was showing. When she finished, she looked at him directly. "You know something," she said. "I know several things," George said. "One of which is that Warren Hargrove has been trying to get a foothold in Virginia's northern shipping contracts for 3 years and has been blocked at every turn by the existing supplier arrangements." "The arrangements that my new contracts are disrupting," Elizabeth said. "Precisely." George looked at her with the measuring regard of a man reassessing a situation he thought he had mapped. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I ask you a direct question?" "You may try," she said. "The documents Hargrove claims to have regarding your father's 1808 loan, do you know for certain they don't exist?" The room went very still. Samuel Hayes was no longer looking at the ceiling. "I know my father's finances thoroughly," Elizabeth said carefully. "I know what debts he carried and what he disclosed." "That is not what I asked," George said. A long pause. "No," Elizabeth said finally. "I cannot say with certainty that no documents exist. I can say that if they exist, they have been shaped to say something that was not true." "That is enough," George said. He leaned back. "Then here is what I believe Hargrove has. He has a document, possibly the Putnam loan record, possibly something adjacent to it, that he has had reframed by a cooperative attorney to suggest your father carried undisclosed debt. He intends to use it in Richmond to suggest that Carter Trading Company's failure was partially self-generated, which would undermine your claim that the Whitmore family's actions were the primary cause." He paused. "And which would make any legal action your family might pursue, now or in the future, significantly more complicated." Nathaniel said. "He's not threatening Elizabeth. He's threatening her ability to hold the history." "Yes," George said. "He's trying to rewrite what happened to her father." Elizabeth did not speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was entirely even and her hands on the desk were entirely still. "Can he do it?" George looked at her steadily. "With a cooperative magistrate and no counter-evidence? Yes." A pause. "What counter do you have?" "Everything," Elizabeth said. She said it quietly. She said it the way people say the most important word in a conversation. Not loudly, not with emphasis, but with the weight of something that has been true for a very long time and has been waiting for the right moment to be useful. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and produced a locked box. She set it on the table and opened it with a key she wore around her neck. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Original correspondence between Harlan Whitmore's attorneys and the county licensing board. A copy of the forged debt document that had been used against Carter Trading Company. The original loan record from the Putnam transaction, in Thomas Carter's own hand, with full disclosure of the amount and terms, signed and witnessed. George Aldrin looked at the contents of that box for a long moment. Then he looked at Elizabeth. "How long have you had these?" he asked. "The Whitmore licensing correspondence I found 4 years ago," she said. "A clerk who was present at the proceedings kept copies. He was an old man, and he wanted someone to know the truth before he died." She paused. "The Putnam loan record is my father's original. I've had it since he died." "You've been holding this for 4 years," Nathaniel said slowly. "Yes. Waiting. Waiting until I had the right position to use it." The silence in the room was enormous. George reached out and picked up one of the letters. "Read it." Set it down. Picked up another. His expression was the careful, controlled expression of a man who is experiencing several strong feelings and has decided this is not the moment for any of them. "This is enough," he said. "Not just for Richmond. This is enough to reopen the licensing case entirely." "I know," Elizabeth said. "Why didn't you—" Nathaniel started. "Because an unmarried woman with no legal standing and no county connections could not walk into a magistrate's proceeding with documents accusing one of the most powerful families in Virginia and expect to be heard," Elizabeth said. Because I needed position. I needed standing. I needed... She stopped. A name, Nathaniel said. She met his eyes. Yes, the word sat there between them. He understood it now, the full shape of it. Not just the chess game, not just the plan. The 7 years, the veil, the rumors, the patient, systematic construction of everything she had built. All of it had been aimed at this. Not revenge. What she had said on their wedding night and had meant with a precision he was only now fully understanding. Restitution. Elizabeth, he said. His voice came out different than he intended. Quieter. With something underneath it that he did not try to hide. She looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. For my father. For what he did. For the 16 years I didn't ask the question I should have asked. He held her gaze. I'm sorry. George Aldrin studied the ceiling. Samuel Hayes looked at his hands. Elizabeth was very still. The thing in her chest that she had been pressing flat for 2 months was not being pressed flat anymore. It was simply there, present and complicated, and larger than she had been allowing herself to admit. We'll deal with Hargrove first, she said. It was not acceptance. It was not dismissal. It was Elizabeth Carter doing what Elizabeth Carter did. Putting the next thing in front of her and moving toward it. But the quality of the silence she left behind it was different from any silence she had produced before. Nathaniel nodded. George put on his professional face. September the 3rd, he said. What do we know about who Hargrove will bring to the meeting? They spent the next 2 hours mapping it. George knew Hargrove's preferred attorney, a man named Sills, who had a reputation for document reconstruction that was well known among Virginia's legal community and carefully never spoken of in public. Nathaniel knew the Richmond business community well enough to know which members of it Hargrove would try to have present as witnesses to any agreement. Samuel knew the physical layout of the meeting place Hargrove had named and the social network around it. Elizabeth listened to all of it and then said, He's going to try to have the meeting in front of witnesses. Why? Nathaniel asked. Because whatever he proposes, he wants it to feel official. He wants people to see me agree to something in public so that if I go back on it, I look like the untrustworthy one. She paused. We change the venue. He's already confirmed. We change it, she said. 2 days before. We send a note saying that we have a conflict with the original location and propose an alternative. Somewhere we choose. She looked at George. Is there a location in Richmond where you have standing relationships? George thought for a moment. The counting house on Broad Street, Martindale's. I've done business there for 15 years. That's where we meet, Elizabeth said. On our ground, with our witnesses if we need them, and without an audience, Hargrove has arranged. She looked around the room. He's been operating under the assumption that he controls the terms of this meeting. We correct that assumption before we arrive. Samuel was smiling, the small, specific smile of a man watching someone he loves do something they were made to do. George was writing notes. Nathaniel was watching Elizabeth with an expression that had moved over the course of the past 2 hours, from careful and attentive to something less careful and considerably more unguarded. I was not trying to hide it. He had decided somewhere in the last hour, without any formal decision-making process, that hiding things from Elizabeth Carter was both pointless and a waste of effort he could better spend elsewhere. She caught him looking. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You're very good at this. She looked at him for a beat. I've had to be, she said. I know. A pause. I'm glad you are. It was the simplest thing. But in Elizabeth Carter's ledger of things people had said to her, things offered without agenda or management or the specific weight of expectation, it landed somewhere it would stay. She went back to the documents. But her hands, Nathaniel noticed, were entirely steady. The ride to Richmond on September the 3rd was 4 hours, and they made it in the early morning while the summer heat was still thin and manageable. Nathaniel and Elizabeth in the carriage, George across from them, Samuel following with the document box secured under his seat. For the first hour, no one said very much. Then George said, Hargrove will try to discredit the licensing correspondence immediately. He'll say it's unverified. I have the clerk's sworn statement, Elizabeth said. He'll say the clerk was unreliable. The clerk was Jonas Reeves, Elizabeth said. He was the county licensing board's chief clerk for 23 years with no disciplinary record, and he gave this statement before a notary 3 years before his death. She paused. Let Hargrove say he's unreliable. I'd like to see him say it to a room. George looked at her, then at Nathaniel, then back out the window with the expression of a man who is revising a number of assessments simultaneously. She does this often? He asked Nathaniel. Constantly, Nathaniel said. And you find it extraordinary, Nathaniel said, without inflection, as if it were a simple fact, because at this point it was. Elizabeth looked out the window and said nothing, but the line of her jaw had changed in a way that George Aldrin, who was very old and very practiced, recognized as a woman trying not to show that something had landed on her. He decided he liked Nathaniel Whitmore more than he had at the wedding. Martindale's counting house on Broad Street had the feel of a place where serious things got decided without a great deal of ceremony, which suited Elizabeth exactly. Hargrove's note responding to the venue change had arrived the previous evening, and it had been sharp, not quite rude, but sharp, and had confirmed the new location while also confirming, in the specific quality of its sharpness, that the change had irritated him. Elizabeth had read it and said nothing and folded it and put it in the box. Hargrove arrived 12 minutes late, which was a choice. How was a large man, broad and well-dressed in the way that comes from money that has been around long enough to know how to wear itself? He had a man on each side of him, Sills, the attorney, and someone Elizabeth did not immediately recognize. And he came in with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who has been winning rooms for decades. He looked at Elizabeth, then at Nathaniel, then at George Aldrin, and there was a small, precise hitch in his confidence at George's presence that he recovered from immediately and that Elizabeth noted and filed away. Whitmore, he said. He extended his hand to Nathaniel. Hargrove, Nathaniel said. He shook it. Hargrove turned to Elizabeth. He did not offer his hand. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, in the tone men use when they are reminding a woman that she is in a room full of men. Mr. Hargrove, Elizabeth said. She pulled out a chair and sat down. Shall we begin? He blinked. He had expected a moment of social navigation first. Pleasantries, positioning, the usual theater of a meeting between people who intend to be adversaries while pretending otherwise. She was already seated and looking at him with those dark, level eyes, and there was nothing in her posture that suggested she intended to perform any of it. He sat down. Sills set a document on the table. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, with the unctuous precision of a man who has prepared his words carefully, my client has come into possession of materials relating to the financial history of Carter Trading Company that have implications for the current management of Whitmore Hall. Show me, Elizabeth said. Sills pushed the document forward. Elizabeth looked at it without touching it. She read it from where she sat, in about 20 seconds. Then she looked up at Hargrove. This is the Putnam loan, she said. A copy of it, yes, Sills said. A copy, she repeated. Not the original. My client obtained... I have the original, Elizabeth said. The room went quiet. She reached to her left, where Samuel had set the document box, and she opened it and produced Thomas Carter's original Putnam loan record, handwritten, witnessed, dated, complete, and set it on the table next to Sills's copy. Sills looked at it. Hargrove looked at it. The man Elizabeth hadn't recognized leaned forward to look at it, and she placed him in that moment, Robert Kane. So Dunmore's network was here in person. This is my father's original record, Elizabeth said. Signed, witnessed, and noting full disclosure of the loan amount and terms. It was disclosed to the county licensing board at the time of the original proceedings. She paused. Your copy appears to be missing the disclosure notation, which is interesting because the disclosure notation is on every other copy I have seen. She looked at Hargrove. Where did your copy come from, Mr. Hargrove? The quality of the silence was different now. My client, Sills started. I'm asking Mr. Hargrove, Elizabeth said. Hargrove looked at her. He had the eyes of a man recalibrating quickly, reassessing the terrain under his feet. "I obtained it through standard business research channels," he said. "Then you were misled by the channel," Elizabeth said. "Because this document," she touched the copy, "is incomplete at best and fabricated at worst, and I am able to demonstrate which." She reached into the box again. "Because I also have these." She set the licensing correspondence on the table. The Whitmore attorney letters. The clerk's sworn statement. George Aldrin watched Hargrove's face and was quietly satisfied by what he saw there. "What I have," Elizabeth said, "is a complete record of what happened to Carter Trading Company. What destroyed it, who made the decisions, and how those decisions were executed." She folded her hands on the table. "What you have is an incomplete document that someone gave you believing it would serve as leverage against me." She looked at him steadily. "It doesn't." Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. Kane shifted in his seat. Sills was very still. "Mrs. Whitmore," Hargrove said, and his voice had changed. Not collapsed, he was too experienced for that, but changed, the specific change of a man moving from one negotiating position to another. "I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of this meeting." "There isn't," Elizabeth said. "You came here to offer me a threat dressed as information. I came here to tell you that the information I have is substantially more complete than yours and that I intend to use it." She paused. "The only question is whether I use it to reopen the original licensing case, which I am now legally positioned to do as a property owner of standing in this county, or whether I use it to establish a public record and move forward from there." "A reopened case," Hargrove said carefully, "would be disruptive for a number of people in Virginia business circles." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "It would." Nathaniel had not spoken since they sat down. He had not needed to. He had sat at Elizabeth's right hand and been present in the specific, deliberate way she had asked him to be. Steady, unreadable. The kind of present that tells everyone in the room that this woman has the full backing of the name behind her. And he had watched her dismantle 4 months of Hargrove's preparation in 11 minutes. And he had felt something that was past admiration and past pride, and was simply, irreducibly, the feeling of a man who has come to understand exactly what he has. Now he said quietly, "We are not interested in disruption for its own sake, Mr. Hargrove. My wife is interested in the truth being known, and this estate operating without interference. If those two things can be accomplished without a formal proceeding, we are open to that conversation." He felt Elizabeth turn to look at him very slightly. He did not look back. Hargrove looked between them. He had come into this room intending to deal with a woman alone. I was dealing with something considerably more unified than that, and the recalibration happening behind his eyes was visible to everyone who knew how to read it. "What terms are you proposing?" he asked. Elizabeth put her hands on the table. "Hargrove Trading withdraws its interest in Whitmore Hall's northern shipping contracts. Your network." She paused on the word just long enough to let him understand that she knew about all of it. "Ceases any effort to interfere in our county relationships. In exchange, the materials I have remain in my possession, and I take no immediate legal action." She met his eyes. "But they remain. And if there is any future interference, the conversation changes." It was not forgiveness. It was not peace. It was a position, clearly stated, fully backed, leaving him exactly no room to imagine that the option he'd come here with was still on the table. Hargrove sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need to consult with my attorney." "You have until Friday," Elizabeth said. She stood up. "Good day, Mr. Hargrove." She picked up the document box. Samuel stood. George stood. Nathaniel stood and buttoned his coat with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who is comfortable leaving a room, and they walked out together into the Richmond afternoon, all 4 of them, without looking back. They were half a block from Martindale's when Samuel Hayes made a sound that, in a less dignified man, would have been a whoop. "Friday," he said. "You gave him until Friday." "He'll respond by Wednesday," Elizabeth said. "How do you—" "Because he came in expecting to have leverage, and he has none, and he knows it, and men like that cannot sit with that knowledge for more than 48 hours, she said. "He'll write Wednesday evening. We'll have the letter Thursday morning." Samuel laughed, a full, genuine laugh, the laugh of a man who has been waiting a very long time for a particular kind of morning. George Aldrin said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I owe you an apology." Elizabeth looked at him. "For what?" "I told your husband, the morning of your wedding, that I was not certain what you were." He said it with the plain honesty of a man who has lived long enough to value accuracy over image. "I understand now." "What am I?" she asked. He considered. "The most prepared person I've ever seen walk into a negotiation." Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Aldrin." Nathaniel said nothing. He walked beside her and said nothing, and after a moment, in the Richmond afternoon, his hand found hers. Not reaching, not claiming, just there. She did not pull away. They walked back to the carriage in the September light, 4 people with the documents that told the truth about the past tucked safely away. And for the first time since she had been a 17-year-old girl watching her father's business come apart, Elizabeth Carter walked through a Virginia afternoon without the weight of what she was carrying threatening to bring her to her knees. She was still carrying it. She would always carry it. But she was not carrying it alone. Hargrove's letter arrived on Thursday morning. Elizabeth had said Wednesday evening. It came Thursday at 7, which was close enough that Samuel Hayes, sitting at the kitchen table when Ruth brought it in, looked at it, and then looked at Elizabeth and said nothing at all, because nothing needed to be said. She read it standing up. She did not sit down to read important things. Nathaniel had noticed this months ago and had stopped being surprised by it. She read it in about 40 seconds, set it on the table, and pushed it toward Samuel. He read it. His expression did the thing it did when he was being careful not to show too much. "He agreed," Samuel said. "He agreed to the terms as stated," Elizabeth said, "which is not quite the same thing." "What's the difference?" "A man who agrees to terms because he believes them is different from a man who agrees to terms because he has no other viable option at the moment." She picked up the letter. "Hargrove will stay out of our way for as long as staying out of our way costs him less than the alternative." She folded the letter and put it in the box. "We remain aware." Samuel watched her. "You're not relieved," he said. "I'm satisfied," she said. "It's not the same thing." She picked up her coffee and went to the East Wing. Samuel sat at the table for a moment. Ruth refilled his cup without being asked, because Ruth had been in this house long enough to understand which mornings required it. "She won," Ruth said quietly. "She did," Samuel said. "Then why does she look like a woman who's still fighting something?" Samuel wrapped both hands around his cup. "Because the thing she's been fighting for 7 years wasn't Hargrove," he said. "Hargrove was just the latest version of it." He paused. "The thing she's been fighting is the belief that nobody is going to stay." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Whitmore stayed," she said. "Yes," Samuel said. "He did." He drank his coffee and watched the door to the East Wing and thought about a girl he'd known at 17, whose father had died still apologizing for failing her, and about how long it takes a person to stop waiting for the next apology and start believing in the people who haven't left yet. Nathaniel found her at noon. He knocked on the East Wing door and she said come in, and he came in and set a plate on the edge of her desk. The same kind of thing Clara Holloway had started, and which had apparently become household policy without anyone formally declaring it. And he sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, which was also something that had become its own kind of policy. "Hargrove's letter," he said. "I know you read it," she said. "Ruth told me she left it in the front hall, and you were in the front hall." "I wasn't. I happened to be." "Nathaniel." He settled. "I read it," he said. "And?" "And you were right," he said. "As you generally are." "I wasn't right about the Caldwell meeting timeline," she said. "I thought we'd have confirmation by the end of August. It ran 2 weeks past." "That is an extraordinarily minor example of being wrong. I'm keeping an accurate record," she said. He looked at her. She was at her desk with her pen and her ledger, and the focused forward movement that was as much a part of her as her dark eyes or her straight spine. And he thought about what Samuel had told him 3 weeks ago. Not directly, Samuel was too careful for direct. but in the specific way that a man who has loved someone for a long time tells another man what that person most needs without quite saying it. She's never believed anyone would stay past the point where leaving got easy. "Elizabeth," he said. She looked up. "The licensing case," he said. "George thinks we can have a formal petition submitted to the county board by November. If we move now while the Hargrove documentation is fresh and Aldrin is—" He paused. "Aldrin came to see me yesterday." She set her pen down. "James Aldrin came here? He came to the north fence while I was with Jeb." Nathaniel kept his voice even. He was conciliatory. He said he had been misled about the nature of Hargrove's interest in the estate, and that he wanted me to know he had no personal grievance with the current management. "He's repositioning," Elizabeth said immediately. "Yes. He saw how Richmond went, and he's cutting his losses before the petition filing makes his association with Hargrove a matter of public record." She was thinking quickly. He could see it. The calculation running behind her eyes, the rapid reorganization of pieces on a board. "Did he say anything specific about the licensing case?" "He said that as a member of the county board, he would be inclined to view a properly documented petition favorably." Elizabeth was very still. "He's offering to help," she said. "He's offering to not obstruct," Nathaniel said, "which, from James Aldrin, is about as close to help as we're going to get." She thought for a moment. "George needs to file before the end of October," she said. "Not November. October, while Aldrin's repositioning is fresh, and before he finds a new political calculation that makes obstruction preferable again." I'll tell George," she said. "I need to walk him through the complete documentation sequence anyway." She picked her pen back up. "Can you ask him to come Thursday?" "Already did," Nathaniel said. "He'll be here Thursday at 2. She looked up. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has been paying attention and is no longer apologetic about it. "You moved ahead of me," she said. It was not an accusation. It was something closer to recognition. "I'm learning," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Eat something," she said. "You didn't eat this morning either." He blinked. "How do you know that?" "Ruth," she said, and went back to writing. He picked up the extra fork he'd brought on the plate. 2 forks, she noticed now, 2 portions. And they ate lunch in the East Wing, in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to perform anything for each other. And outside, the summer was finally beginning to think about becoming autumn, and the South Fields were transformed from what they had been in July, and the work that had started with mud on Elizabeth's hem at 6 in the morning had become something both of them could see from the window without having to imagine what it would look like when it was done. It looked like this. It looked like exactly this. George came on Thursday and spent 4 hours in the East Wing with Elizabeth and the documents, and when he left, he had a complete filing plan and the expression of a man who has just been part of something that mattered. On his way out, he found Nathaniel on the front porch and stopped. "She's remarkable," George said. Not with surprise anymore. With the plain acknowledgement of something that had moved past observation into simple fact. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "When she first came to see me," George said. Nathaniel turned. "What?" 3 years ago," George said. "She came to my office in town. She had the licensing correspondence and asked me to review it." He paused. "I told her that without a formal legal standing, property ownership, a recognized position in the county, there was nothing actionable she could do with it." Nathaniel was very quiet. "She thanked me," George said, wrote something in a small notebook she carried, and left. He looked out at the fields. "I didn't know at the time what she wrote. I imagine now that she wrote my name and the word standing and began working backward from there to figure out how to get it." He paused. "She didn't find you, Nathaniel. She identified what she needed and then found the version of you that could provide it." "I know," Nathaniel said. "That doesn't trouble you?" Nathaniel looked into the fields, the transformed, living, breathing fields that were now producing what they should have been producing for years. "It troubled me in July," he said. "In September, I find it clarifying." George looked at him. "She needed a name and a position," Nathaniel said. "She used mine. And in exchange, She gave this estate something it hasn't had in 20 years, which is someone who actually gives a damn about making it work. He paused. I think that's a reasonable transaction. And now? Now it's not a transaction, Nathaniel said. George looked at him for a moment longer, with the eyes of a man who has been watching Nathaniel Whitmore make decisions for 30 years and had privately feared, for most of that time, that the best ones were beyond him. No, George said. I don't believe it is. He got his horse and rode back to town, and Nathaniel stood on the porch and watched him go, and thought about a woman who had come to this man's office 3 years ago with a notebook and a plan, and the cold, clear-eyed determination to build everything she needed from nothing, and had done exactly that, and had walked down his church aisle 4 months ago like she had already won, because in most of the ways that mattered, she had. He went inside to find her. She was in the East Wing still, which was not surprising, but she had stopped writing, which was. She was sitting with both hands flat on the desk, and the lamp burning, and the look on her face of someone who has finished a very long piece of work and is not yet sure what to do with the absence of it. George is gone, Nathaniel said. I know. He came in and sat down. How are you? She looked at him with a slight flicker of something. Not irritation, not surprise, something more complicated than either. People did not ask Elizabeth Carter how she was. They asked her what the plan was, what the numbers said, what the next step looked like. The question landed differently than she knew how to handle quickly. She stopped, started again. I'm not sure, she said. I've been moving toward this for a long time. The filing, the case, all of it. And now George has everything he needs, and it's in motion, and She looked at her hands. I don't know what I do with the part of me that has been pointed at this for 7 years and is now not needed in the same way. That part of you could rest, Nathaniel said. She looked at him. I'm serious, he said. It could rest. The fields are in good shape. The accounts are solid. The Caldwell contract is running. George has the filing. He held her gaze. You are allowed to stop moving for more than a meal's worth of time, Elizabeth. I don't know how to do that, she said. It was the most unguarded thing she had ever said to him. She knew it the moment it was out of her mouth, felt the familiar reflex to qualify it or redirect it or wrap it in something more manageable. And she did not do any of those things. She sat with it. The way Nathaniel had been sitting with uncomfortable truths for months, she sat with her own. You could start, he said, by telling me about your father. The room went very quiet. Not the careful quiet of a negotiation, not the efficient quiet of two people working. A different quiet. The kind that only exists when something real is about to be said. Thomas Carter, Nathaniel said, was a man I knew by reputation and by the damage my father did to him. That's all I know. I'd like to know more. He paused. If you want to tell me. Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. How was funny, she said. The word came out with the specific weight of something that hasn't been said in a very long time. People don't talk about that. They talk about his reputation, his business, what happened to him. But he had this way of making an observation about something ordinary that would make everyone around him stop and laugh, and he always looked slightly surprised when they did, like he hadn't quite intended to be funny. It had just come out that way. She paused. He used to say that the best businesses were built the same way as the best jokes. You had to understand exactly what the other person expected and then give them something true instead. Nathaniel said nothing. He was watching her with complete attention and no agenda, the way people very rarely watch each other. He was not a perfect businessman, she said. He was generous with credit. He trusted people longer than the numbers justified. He thought that if you treated people with respect, that would come back around to you in the end. She paused. He was right, as a general philosophy. He was wrong about the specific people who would exploit it. My father, Nathaniel said. Your father was a particular case, she said. Your father understood exactly how to look like the kind of man mine would trust. She looked at the window. He came to our house for dinner twice in 1808. He was charming. He asked my father questions and actually waited for the answers. My father thought he'd made a genuine connection. She was quiet for a moment. The licensing proceedings started 4 months later. Nathaniel's hands on the arms of the chair tightened slightly. She saw it. "I'm not telling you this to wound you," she said. "I know," he said. "Keep going." "My father tried to fight it," she said. "For almost a year. He borrowed against everything he had. He hired attorneys. He genuinely believed, that if he could just get in front of the right people and show them what had actually happened, it would be corrected." She stopped. "He believed in the system, even at the end." "Did that frustrate you?" Nathaniel asked. "His faith in it?" She thought about this with the honesty she brought to things she was no longer trying to manage. "When I was 17, yes, enormously. I wanted him to fight differently, harder, without rules." She paused. "Now I understand that his faith was not naivete. It was who he was. He had built something real, and he believed real things eventually got recognized." A beat. "He wasn't wrong about that either, just about the timeline." "The petition," Nathaniel said. "When it goes through, and it will go through, what does it mean for his name?" "It means the official record reflects what actually happened," Elizabeth said. "Carter Trading Company's failure is attributed to the licensing interference, not to any failing on his part. Any outstanding reputational damage is corrected by the public record." She paused. "He can't know that, but the people who knew him will." "Is that enough?" he asked. She was quiet for a long time. "It has to be," she said. "It's what there is." Nathaniel stood up slowly. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched him. The set of his shoulders, the stillness he was capable of now that had not been there in July, the thing that happened to a man when he stopped running from the shape of who he was. "My father died believing he was a success," Nathaniel said. "That's the hardest part of it. He never had a moment where he understood what his success had cost. He just died with it intact." He turned around. "I used to think that was lucky, that he was spared something." He met her eyes. "I don't think that anymore." "What do you think now?" she asked. "I think he was spared the only thing that might have made him worth something," Nathaniel said. "The reckoning. The moment where you look at what you've done and you decide who you want to be after it." He paused. "I think I've been being given that moment since July, and I think I've been slow to take it." "You haven't been slow," Elizabeth said. "Elizabeth, you fixed the Dawson roof," she said. "Yourself, in the middle of July. Nobody asked you. Nobody was watching." She held his gaze. "I know because Clara told me, and Clara told me because Jeb told her, and Jeb told her because he was there and he thought I should know." She paused. "That was not a slow man." Nathaniel looked at her. "You knew about that in July," he said slowly. "Yes." "And you didn't say anything." "You didn't do it for me to see," she said. "It would have been wrong to make it into something for me to see." She paused. "But I saw it." The room was very quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not empty but full of everything that two people have said to each other and everything they haven't said, and the narrowing distance between those two things. "I owe you an apology," Nathaniel said. "You apologized in Richmond." "Not for my father," he said. "I apologized for my father in Richmond, and I meant it, and I'll mean it every time I say it. But I owe you a separate one." He did not move from where he was standing, but his voice was very direct and very steady. "I married you for your money. I looked at you as a solution to a problem before I looked at you as a person. I told myself that was just practical, and I did not examine it any further." He paused. "That was wrong. Not because of what it led to. I'll be grateful for what it led to for the rest of my life. But because you were a person, and I didn't look at you like one until you made me." Elizabeth stood up. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and she stood there with the full, unmanaged weight of everything she was. The plan, and the grief, and the 7 years, and the veil, and the girl at 17, and the woman now. And she said, "I married you to use your name, and your position, and the debt your family owed mine. A pause. I did not expect to find someone worth being honest with. Are you being honest with me now? He asked. Yes, she said. I'm terrified of it, and I'm doing it anyway, which is, for me, the same as honesty. Something moved across his face. Not the guarded, careful expressions she had catalogued over 4 months, but something open and real and irreversible, the look of a man who has stopped protecting himself from the thing he actually wants. He reached up and touched her face. Not the veil. There was no veil. There had been no veil since the church. Just her face, with the careful attention of a man handling something that matters. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, the thing she had been pressing flat since July was entirely present on her face. Not pressed flat at all, simply there, complicated and real and very much alive. I know, she said. That's what I'm getting used to. The weeks that followed were different from everything that had come before, and the difference was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It simply settled, the way things settle when the work that needed doing has been done, and what's left is the living part. Nathaniel stopped sleeping badly. It happened gradually, and then completely, the way sleep returns when the thing keeping a person awake has finally been addressed. Elizabeth started leaving the East Wing before midnight. Ruth noticed first, then Clara, then Samuel, who came by on a Thursday and found her in the kitchen talking to Ruth about the winter provision orders, which was not unusual, except that she was laughing at something Ruth had said. A real laugh, not the precise, controlled near smile he had been watching for years, but an actual laugh, unplanned and unguarded. And Samuel stood in the doorway for a moment before she saw him, and he put his hat back on and went around to knock at the front properly, because some moments deserve to start again. The filing happened in October, as planned. George Aldrin submitted the complete petition to the County Land Board on the 14th, with James Aldrin sitting in his board seat and looking at his own hands as the documentation was read into the record. The licensing correspondence. The clerk's sworn statement. The original Putnam loan with full disclosure notation. The complete case for what had happened to Carter Trading Company in 1809 and who had made it happen. It took 3 weeks for the board to deliberate. Elizabeth did not wait quietly. She waited the way she did everything, in motion, forward-moving, managing the winter preparation and the Caldwell contract expansion, and a correspondence with a Philadelphia textile connection that Samuel had opened in October. She moved through every day with the same focused competence that had always been the most visible thing about her. But there was something different in it now, a quality of ease that had not been there before, a willingness to pause, to look up from the work, to be in the room she was actually in rather than the next one. Nathaniel watched her, the way you watch something you have come to value so precisely that the watching is itself a kind of work. Attentive, unhurried, grateful for the ordinary details. I went to the South Field every morning, and he spoke to Jeb Holloway, and he checked the drainage and the fences and the crops, with the engaged attention of a man who has finally understood what it means to be responsible for something, and has decided that understanding was long overdue. He wrote letters to the men his father had driven out of business, and he did not ask for anything in return. He simply wrote and said that he understood now what had happened, and that he was sorry, and that he wanted the record to be honest, even if the apology was late. Some men wrote back, some didn't. He kept writing. Elizabeth found one of the letters on his desk one evening. Not reading it, she had come in to leave a document he needed, and it was there, open, in his handwriting. And she read 4 lines before she realized what it was, and set it down, and walked out, and stood in the hallway for a moment. She went back to the East Wing. She sat at her desk. She did not write anything for a while. Then she wrote a letter of her own. To her father's former head clerk, a man named Davies, who had found work in Baltimore after Carter Trading's collapse. She had maintained the correspondence over the years, practically, carefully, using him as a source of information and record when she needed it. She wrote him now and told him about the filing, about what the board was reviewing, about what the record would say when it was done. She wrote, "He did not fail. He was failed. The record will say so. I wanted you to know before it becomes official, because you were there and you deserve to hear it from someone who was also there." She sealed it and gave it to Ruth to post, and went back to work. And she did not cry, because Elizabeth Carter had not cried since she was 17 years old. But she sat at her desk for a long time after the letter was gone, and breathed in a way that was slower and fuller than her usual working breath. And that was enough. The board's decision arrived on a Wednesday morning in November. It came by formal post, in the county's official envelope, and it arrived at Whitmore Hall at 8:30, while Nathaniel and Elizabeth were both at breakfast, which Samuel would later say was the universe having a small, decent sense of occasion. Nathaniel got to it first. Ruth brought it to the table, and he picked it up, and he looked at Elizabeth, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Open it," she said. He opened it. He read it. He read it once quickly, and then once again more slowly, the second time with a quality of attention that was not checking his own reading, but simply staying with it, letting it be real. He set it on the table between them and turned it so she could read it. She read it. The board had reviewed the complete documentation and found sufficient cause to amend the official record of the 1809 licensing proceedings. The failure of Carter Trading Company was attributed to the documented interference with the licensing contracts. Thomas Carter's name was cleared of any implication of financial mismanagement or undisclosed debt. The amended record would stand as the official county history. It was 3 paragraphs, formal, dry, precisely worded. The language of official proceedings, which is the language of things that cannot be taken back. Elizabeth read it twice. She set it down. She put both hands flat on the table the same way she had the morning after Hargrove's letter. But this time her face was entirely different. Not the still, controlled face of a woman managing what she felt, but something open and present that she did not appear to be trying to manage at all. Nathaniel said nothing. He waited. He had learned, over 5 months, exactly how to wait for Elizabeth. "He was right," she said. Her voice was quiet and completely steady. "About the system. About the record eventually reflecting the truth." She paused. "He was right, and he didn't live to know it, and I—" She stopped. "He knew you," Nathaniel said. "He knew what you would do." She looked at him. "He raised you," Nathaniel said. "He watched you for 17 years. He knew exactly what kind of person you were." He met her eyes across the breakfast table, with the full, unhidden regard of a man who means what he says without reservation. He knew the record was in good hands. Elizabeth was quiet for a very long moment. When she finally spoke, the word came out without architecture or management or anything between her and it. "Yes," she said. "I think he did." Samuel arrived at 10, because Samuel always seemed to know when to arrive, and Nathaniel met him at the door and handed him the letter without a word, and Samuel read it on the front porch in the November morning, and when he finished, he stood very still with his hand flat over the letter and his eyes at the sky for a moment, and Nathaniel stood beside him and did not say anything, because some things have been carried too long to be reduced to words. When Samuel came inside, Elizabeth was in the front hall, and he crossed to her, and she crossed to him, and he held her. The way a man holds someone he has known and loved for 23 years, and she let him, which was itself something new. The letting, the not managing, the simply being held. "Tom would have loved to see this," Samuel said into the top of her head. "I know," she said. "He would have said something funny about it, something that made it sound like he'd expected it all along." "He always did that," she said. "Yes," Samuel said. "He always did." He held her for a moment longer, and then he stepped back and cleared his throat and said, "Well, what's for breakfast?" And Elizabeth laughed. The real laugh, the unplanned one, the one that had been coming more often since October. And Ruth, who had been hovering in the kitchen doorway, produced eggs and coffee, and the November morning settled around them like something that had finally arrived after a very long journey. The county knew about the decision within a week. It spread the way county news spreads, quickly and in multiple directions simultaneously, carried by people who have been waiting for it, and people who didn't know they were waiting for it, and people who are simply drawn to any story where the ending is different from what they expected. The reactions were various. Clive Dunmore, for his part, said nothing publicly, and moved through the following weeks with the specific careful neutrality of a man managing a significant social recalibration. He did not come to Whitmore Hall again. James Aldrin wrote a brief formal letter to Nathaniel acknowledging the board's decision and expressing his satisfaction that the official record now accurately reflected the historical facts, which was the most he was capable of, and which was, under the circumstances, sufficient. Paul Hendricks was heard to say, at the general store on Broad Street, that he had always thought there was more to the Carter business than people said, which caused the man he was saying it to, Jeb Holloway, who had come in for winter supplies, to look at him for a moment with the clear, level eyes of a man who has worked the land for 20 years and has no patience for revisionism. "Is that right?" Jeb said. "Well, yes, I always—" "Mr. Hendricks," Jeb said, "I'm going to collect my order." And he did, without further conversation. He told Elizabeth about it on Thursday, and she looked at him with the real smile, the complete one, the one Nathaniel had seen emerge over the course of 5 months from behind the almost smiles and the near smiles and the carefully controlled variations on warmth, and said, "Thank you, Mr. Holloway." "Yes, ma'am," Jeb said, with the ease of a man who has figured out exactly where he stands. Clara Holloway, for her part, came to the East Wing on Friday with a piece of apple cake and sat down across from Elizabeth and said, "My father worked the Carter shipping docks in 1805. Elizabeth looked up from her writing. "Did he? He talked about your father sometimes," Clara said. "Said he was the kind of man who knew every worker's name and remembered them the next year too." She set the cake on the desk. "I thought you might want to know that someone else remembered him that way." Elizabeth's hand on her pen was very still. "Thank you, Clara," she said. "Eat the cake," Clara said. "I used the good apples." Elizabeth ate the cake. The first snow came in late November, which was early for Virginia, and it came overnight so that the estate woke to a different version of itself. The fields and the rooftops and the fence lines transformed by the kind of ordinary, annual miracle that never quite loses its effect, no matter how many times a person has seen it. Elizabeth had not seen a winter at Whitmore Hall before. She was standing at the East Wing window at 6 in the morning, coffee in hand, looking at the changed landscape when Nathaniel came and stood beside her. He had gotten up early. He always got up early now. It had become as natural as breathing. And he came and stood beside her with his own coffee, and they stood together at the window, looking at the snow without saying anything. After a while he said, "First winter here." "Yes," she said. "The south field holds up well in snow," he said. "The drainage work we did in July. It'll make a difference when the thaw comes. Less flooding." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about the thaw since July?" "Since August," he said. "Jeb mentioned it." She looked back at the window. "You've been learning," she said. "I've had a good teacher," he said. "Jeb is an excellent teacher." "I wasn't talking about Jeb," he said. The morning light was thin and white and very clear, the specific clarity that snow brings, and she stood next to him in it. This woman who had spent 7 years building walls high enough to be safe and had found, on the other side of all that building, that what she had built was also a prison. And she felt the walls for what they were, and she felt, for the first time, that she did not need them in the same way. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I came into this marriage with a plan," she said. "A very complete plan. Every contingency mapped, every relationship in the county assessed, every document organized and ready." She paused. "I did not plan for you to be what you are." "What am I?" he asked, and his voice was quiet and entirely without guard. She looked at him. "Someone I trust," she said. "I didn't plan for that." He was very still. "Elizabeth," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. "I trust you, and I did not plan for it, and I am, still, learning what to do with that. I will probably continue managing things in ways that don't leave enough room for you, because I have been doing that for 7 years, and it is deeply habitual." She met his eyes. "But I am aware of it, and I am working on it." And I want you to know that whatever it looks like from the outside, from the inside, it is the most significant effort I am making." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know. You know? I've been watching you make that effort since August," he said. "I see it, every day." A pause. "I'm not in a hurry." She blinked. It was the smallest possible expression of being caught off guard by something good, and it was completely genuine, and it was the most unguarded he had ever seen her face in 5 months of watching it. "You're not," she said. "I'm not in a hurry," he said again. "We have time. We have the estate and the work and the winter and the thaw and whatever comes after the thaw. We have all of it." He looked at her steadily. "Take the time you need." She stood with that for a moment. The snow outside was entirely still, and the morning was entirely quiet, and the house around them was warm with the specific warmth of a place that has been properly cared for, and Elizabeth Carter, who had planned for nearly everything, stood in the warm stillness of a morning she had not planned for at all, and felt it. The full, unmanaged weight of being somewhere she had not expected to arrive. Not safe exactly. Safety was a wall, and she was learning to live without quite so many walls. Something better than safe, something real. She turned from the window. "We need to look at the winter accounts this morning," she said. "The provision estimates are off by about 12%. "I know," he said. "I looked at them last night." She looked at him. "You looked at the accounts." "You left them on the kitchen table," he said, with the particular ease of a man who has become, without quite deciding to, the kind of person who looks at accounts left on kitchen tables. "And? The 12% is the timber order," he said. "I think we can rebalance it against the February supply run." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned toward the east wing. "Come show me," she said. He followed her, and the snow outside the window stayed white and still and entirely unhurried, and inside the house, two people who had not planned on needing each other sat down together at the desk and opened the accounts and began the ordinary, essential work of building something together that was worth the building. Hargrove's written concession arrived on a Friday, which was fitting, because Fridays had become the day that things were settled in the Whitmore household. It was brief and precise and entirely bloodless, the language of a man who has lost and intends to lose cleanly rather than messily, which was the one quality Elizabeth had always respected in an adversary. He withdrew all interest in the northern shipping contracts. He acknowledged no wrongdoing, which she had expected. He wished them well in their future endeavors, which she had not expected, and which she suspected was Sills's addition rather than Hargrove's genuine sentiment. She folded it and put it in the box with everything else. Nathaniel was watching her from the doorway. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. She put the box in the bottom drawer and turned the key and set the key on the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then she pushed it toward him. He looked at the key, then at her. "You keep it," he said. "I'm giving it to you," she said. "I know. I'm saying keep it." He met her eyes. "It's your history, Elizabeth. It'll always be yours. I'm not trying to take it from you. I'm just not going anywhere." She left the key on the desk. She looked at it for another moment, and then she looked at him and she said, "I know you're not." It was a small thing. It was everything. She left the key on the desk, and that was where it stayed. Winter settled over Whitmore Hall with the particular completeness of a Virginia winter that has decided to be thorough about itself. The work slowed the way. Farm work always slows in cold months, not stopping, never stopping, but turning inward, becoming the work of preparation and maintenance, and planning for the spring that is always, even in December, already being built toward. Elizabeth had never experienced a slow season before. She had been in motion for so long that stillness felt like a wrong note, something that needed correcting. She sat with it anyway. She sat with it at breakfast when there was no crisis to manage, and sat with it in the evenings when the accounts were balanced and the correspondence was answered and there was nothing urgent left to move toward. Nathaniel watched her navigate it with the careful attention of a man who understands that some adjustments cannot be hurried. "What did you do?" he asked one evening, before the plan. She looked up from the book she had not been reading. What do you mean? Before Carter Trading fell, before the veil, before all of it. He was sitting across from her in the parlor. They had been spending evenings in the parlor since November, which had happened gradually and then completely, the way the good things between them happened. You were 17. What did you do with your time? She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which took a moment because it was a country she had not visited in a long time. I read, she said. History mostly. My father had a good library. She paused. I was learning the shipping business. He was teaching me the accounts, the supplier relationships, how to read a contract. She paused again. I argued with him about everything. You argued with your father? Constantly. He loved it. The real smile came, the complete one. He said I was the best business mind he'd ever encountered, and also the most exhausting person he'd ever met, which he said were probably related. Nathaniel laughed. It was a genuine laugh, easy and unguarded, and it surprised her slightly because she was still, even now, not entirely used to the sound of him being genuinely easy. He was right on both counts, Nathaniel said. I was right about most things, she said, and then quieter. I wish you could have met him. The room was very still. So do I, Nathaniel said. She looked at him across the parlor. This man she had chosen for his name and his debt, and had found something she had stopped believing existed. And she felt the wish the same way she felt most things now, fully, and without pressing it flat. He would have argued with you, she said. He argued with everyone he respected. I would have argued back, Nathaniel said. He would have liked you for it. She looked at the fire. Eventually. Only eventually? He was protective, she said. He would have watched you very carefully for a while. Like Samuel does. Samuel still watches you carefully. I've noticed, Nathaniel said. I think I've been passing whatever the test is, because last week he asked my opinion on the spring planting schedule without Elizabeth in the room. She raised an eyebrow. He asked your opinion? He asked it, and then explained at length why my opinion was incomplete, and then told me what the correct answer was, Nathaniel said. But he asked. She looked at him. That's the highest form of respect Samuel Hayes has, she said. He only argues with people he thinks are worth arguing with. Then I'm glad to be worth it, he said. She went back to the book she hadn't been reading, and he went back to the letter he was writing, and the fire burned, and the winter pressed quietly against the windows and the parlor, held them the way good rooms hold people who have found their way to each other, without ceremony, without effort, with the ordinary miracle of warmth. It was Ruth who told Elizabeth in January that 3 of the neighboring estates had sent inquiries about the Whitmore drainage method. Elizabeth looked up from the breakfast table. Which estates? Harmon's Ridge, the Bellwether property, and the old Caston land, Ruth said. Jeb says the men on those properties have been watching the Southfield results since autumn. Elizabeth put down her coffee. She thought for a moment. Who manages Harmon's Ridge now? A man named Coates. He's been there 2 years, came up from the Carolinas. Jeb says he's a straight dealer. And the Bellwether property? That's young Mrs. Bellwether, widow. She's been managing it herself since her husband died in 15. Jeb says the workers respect her. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Tell Jeb to let them know we're open to a conversation in the spring. Ruth nodded and went back to the kitchen. Nathaniel, who had heard all of this from the other end of the table, said, You're going to expand. I'm going to share what works, Elizabeth said. Those are sometimes the same thing. They are, she agreed. Is that a problem? He looked at her with the expression he'd developed over the winter, not the careful, watchful look of the early months, but something more comfortable, the expression of a man who finds the person across from him genuinely interesting and has stopped being surprised by that. No, he said. It's not a problem. Good, she said. Because Mrs. Bellwether's land borders our north edge, and a functional relationship with that property would be useful in spring when we start on the timber situation. You've already mapped it, he said. I've been thinking about it since November, she said. The slow season, he said. The slow season, she agreed, with the small, clear look that meant she understood exactly what he was pointing to and was choosing not to be managed about it. He let it go. He had learned which things to let go. February brought the kind of cold that settles into bones and stays. And it also brought a letter from George Aldrin that arrived on a Tuesday, and that Nathaniel read at the breakfast table and then set down very carefully. Elizabeth looked at his face. "What is it?" He slid it across to her. She read it. George had received communication from a legal contact in Philadelphia. A man named Atwood, an attorney who had handled estate matters for several Virginia families over the years. Atwood had seen the county record amendment when it was published. County records were circulated among certain legal communities for the purposes of ongoing estate management, and had written to George because he recognized the Carter name. "I had in his possession," Atwood wrote, "a document that Thomas Carter had filed with his Philadelphia offices in 1809, at the height of the licensing proceedings. It was a formal letter of record, a detailed account of what had happened, signed and notarized, describing Harlan Whitmore's actions against Carter Trading Company with complete specificity. Thomas Carter had known he was losing. He had written the full account before it was over and filed it with a Philadelphia attorney and instructed that it be preserved and produced if anyone ever formally investigated the matter. He had done it so there would be a record. He had done it so that if Elizabeth ever came looking, she would find something. Elizabeth set the letter down. She sat very still for a full 10 seconds. Nathaniel did not say anything. He watched her with the complete, unhurried attention he had given her since July. The same attention he had given the Southfield and the tenant houses and the things that mattered and needed to be looked at honestly. "He knew," she said. Her voice was entirely steady and entirely wrecked in the same breath. "He knew I would look." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He filed it in 1809, when he still had legal costs to pay and attorney fees he couldn't afford." She stopped, started again. "He spent money he didn't have to file a document with a Philadelphia attorney because he believed I would one day need it." "He trusted you," Nathaniel said. "The same way you trusted the system would eventually work, because he raised you to believe that." She stood up. She crossed to the window and stood with her back to him, and she did not say anything for a long time. He did not go to her. He waited. He had learned the specific patience of a man who understands that some things need to happen in the exact space they need and cannot be hurried or managed or improved by the presence of another person's comfort. When she turned around, her eyes were wet. Not overflowing. Elizabeth Carter's eyes did not overflow, but wet, present, fully feeling something she was no longer pressing flat. "I need to write to Atwood," she said. "George has already sent him a preliminary reply requesting the document be transferred to us," Nathaniel said. "I told him you would want to handle the full correspondence yourself." She looked at him. "You told George that before I read the letter," she said. "I read the letter before breakfast," he said. "I wanted to have something ready." "You—" She stopped, looked at him, really looked at him. The full, unhidden looking that had become possible between them only in the last few months. "You anticipated what I'd need." "I'm learning," he said. The same words he had said months ago, but different now. Not the self-deprecating admission of a man catching up, but the statement of a man who has arrived somewhere and knows it. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, and she put both hands on either side of his face, the same way he had touched hers in October. Careful and deliberate and full of intention, and she said, "Nathaniel." "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said important, true things. Without preparation, without architecture, just the fact itself, delivered plainly into the room. "I did not plan to. I was not looking for it. And I am telling you now because I have been sitting with it since November, and I have decided that not saying it is the wrong choice." He put his hands over hers. "I know," he said. "You know?" "I've known since the Caldwell meeting," he said. "When you handed me the extra fork at lunch and didn't acknowledge it. That was when I knew." She blinked. "The fork. You didn't acknowledge it," he said. "You just knew I hadn't eaten and made sure I had what I needed without making it into something I had to respond to. That is how you love people, Elizabeth. practically and entirely, and without requiring acknowledgement. He held her gaze. I knew in September. It took me until October to admit it. I've been waiting for you to be ready to say it. She looked at him for a long moment. You waited, she said. You were worth waiting for, he said simply. She kissed him then. Not gently, not tentatively, not the way people kiss when they are still managing the experience, but fully, the way Elizabeth Carter did everything that mattered, with complete commitment and without half measures. And he kissed her back with everything he had not said, and everything he had been waiting to give, and the whole long, strange, unlikely history of how they had arrived at this kitchen in February, with snow on the ground, and the estate transformed, and the record corrected, and their two damaged, determined selves somehow standing together on the same ground. When they finally broke apart, she stayed where she was for a moment, with her forehead against his, and the kitchen was warm and entirely quiet. You're insufferable, she said. I'm patient, he corrected. Those are the same thing. I've been told, he said. She laughed. The real one. The unplanned one. And he laughed too, and it was the specific sound of two people who have stopped being careful around each other. And Ruth Cantor, passing in the hallway, heard it and kept walking with a full, quiet expression that was the most satisfaction she had allowed herself in 11 years of working at Whitmore Hall. The spring came the way it always does in Virginia, abruptly and with complete commitment, the cold giving way to warmth in the space of about a week, and the Southfields doing exactly what Jeb Holloway had predicted in October, which was draining clean and fast, and coming into the planting season in better condition than anyone currently working the land had ever seen them. Elizabeth stood at the fence line with Nathaniel on the first genuinely warm morning in March, and looked at what the drainage work had produced, and said nothing for a long time. Jeb came and stood on her other side. He was not a man who required conversation either, and the three of them stood together in the March morning looking at what a year of work had made. Tom Dawson's thinking about staying, Jeb said. His brother's been writing him from Kentucky about the land out there. Tom was going to go in the spring. Now he's thinking about staying. Elizabeth looked at him. Why? Because this is worth staying for, Jeb said simply. He tipped his hat and went back to his crew without further elaboration, which was the most Jeb Holloway had ever said about anything that wasn't strictly operational. Nathaniel watched him go. Then he looked at Elizabeth. Is that enough? He said. Knowing someone stayed because it was worth it? She thought about it, genuinely, fully, without reaching for the quick answer. Yes, she said. That's the point of all of it. Someone staying because it's worth staying for. He took her hand on the fence line. She let him, without managing it or looking around to see who might see, because there was no part of her left that needed to manage the simple fact of being held by someone who intended to stay. The Philadelphia document arrived in April. It came in a leather case, carefully preserved, and Atwood's accompanying letter described Thomas Carter as the most meticulous client he had ever handled. Everything organized, everything witnessed, everything written in the clear, direct hand of a man who wanted to be understood. Elizabeth opened the case alone, early in the morning before the house was up. She read her father's account from beginning to end. She read it in his voice, which she could still hear as clearly as she could hear anything. The slight Virginia lilt, the precision, the way he organized an argument from its foundation outward. She read it and she understood for the first time, fully, what his last year had actually been. Not the failure she had carried in her memory, but the deliberate, careful work of a man who was losing and knew it, and was making sure the truth would survive him. He had written, in the final paragraph, I do not know what use this record will be made of or by whom. I write it for the sake of accuracy, and because I believe that accuracy eventually wins, and because I have a daughter who will not stop until she has found the truth, and I want her to find it already organized when she arrives. Elizabeth sat with that for a long time. When Nathaniel came down and found her at the kitchen table with the document open in front of her and her coffee cold and the early April light coming in strong, he sat down across from her and said nothing and waited. She pushed the document toward him. He read the last paragraph. He set it down. He knew you, Nathaniel said. He did, she said. Do you understand now, he said carefully, That the thing you've been carrying, the idea that you failed him, that you should have moved faster or built better or gotten here sooner. Do you understand that it was never true? She looked at him. He was not waiting to be rescued, Nathaniel said. He was organizing so you'd have what you needed when you arrived. Those are two entirely different things. The thing she had carried since she was 17. Not just the grief. The grief was real and would always be real, but the specific weight of believing she had been too slow, too young, too small to stop it. She felt it shift in a way it had been shifting by increments since July, since Richmond, since February. And she felt it shift now with the particular finality of something that has been carried to its destination and can be set down. Not gone, not forgotten. Set down. Her hands free. Yes, she said. I understand that now. He reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his and held them the way you hold something you have no intention of letting go. And she sat in that April morning in the house that had become hers in every sense, the house she had come to as a plan and was staying in as a life. And she felt, for the first time in 10 years, that her hands were entirely free. Samuel Hayes came for dinner on the last Friday in April. He had been coming for dinner more often since February, not formally invited, simply arriving at a time when it was reasonable to arrive for dinner, because that was what Samuel did with people he loved. And the distinction between invited and simply expected had dissolved sometime in the winter without any formal announcement. He sat at the table with Nathaniel and Elizabeth and Clara and Jeb Holloway, who had also been coming for dinner on Fridays with increasing regularity. And Ruth brought out the spring lamb that Clara had helped with. And they ate and argued about the spring planting schedule and the Bellwether property situation, and whether the Caldwell contract would need renegotiating in the summer. And it was loud and specific and completely alive with the particular energy of people who are doing real work together and know it. At one point, Samuel said, to no one in particular, "The county's talking about the Whitmore approach." "What approach?" Nathaniel said. "The drainage system, the tenant contracts, the supplier renegotiation." Samuel helped himself to more bread. James Aldrin mentioned it at a board meeting. Apparently 2 families over in the next county are trying to replicate the method. "We should formalize it," Elizabeth said immediately. Everyone at the table looked at her. "A written system," she said. "Everything we've done in the past year, the drainage method, the contract structure, the supply chain approach. Put it on paper, and it becomes something that can be shared instead of something that gets guessed at and done wrong." She was thinking as she spoke, the way she always thought when something was clicking into place. George could help with the legal structure. "You want to publish it?" Nathaniel said. "I want to make it useful to people who need it," she said. "There are 15 estates within 30 miles of here managing their land the way this estate was managed in 1815. If what we've built here can change that, it should." Jeb Holloway was looking at his plate with the expression of a man who has been in the presence of an idea he recognizes as important. Clara looked at Elizabeth with the steady regard she had brought to their Thursday lunches since July. "You'd share it free?" she asked. "It's not information I invented," Elizabeth said. "Jeb knows the drainage. Samuel knows the supply chains. Ruth knows the household management. I organized it. That's different from owning it." The table was quiet for a moment. Samuel Hayes looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Elizabeth. "All right," he said. "We formalize it." She nodded and went back to her lamb, and the conversation moved on to the Bellwether property and whether Mrs. Bellwether's approach to her timber stands was sound, and no one made a ceremony of it, because it was not a ceremony. It was just another decision made at a dinner table by people who had figured out how to make decisions together. That was the thing about Whitmore Hall in the spring of 1818, that the county could see from the outside and could not entirely explain from there. It was not dramatic. It was not a transformation that had happened in a single event or a single revelation. It had happened the way good things happen, in accumulated daily choices, in small honestries compounded, in 2 people who had come together for wrong reasons discovering, by degrees, the right ones. On a Saturday morning in May, Elizabeth found the small notebook. It was in a drawer she had not opened since winter, one of the drawers in the east wing where she had put things during the move-in and then not gone back to. She was reorganizing in preparation for the spring correspondence expansion, and she opened the drawer, and there it was, the small notebook she had carried when she visited George Aldrin's office 3 years ago, the one she had written in when he told her she needed standing. She opened it. The handwriting was hers, but it belonged to a different version of her. The version that was still all plan and no room for anything that didn't serve the plan. She read through it with the strange experience of reading something both completely familiar and entirely foreign. Names, connections, property assessments, debt levels, the complete map of everything she had built toward. And there, halfway through, in her own handwriting, Whitmore Hall, debt sufficient, name still carries, need a version of him that can be moved. She looked at that line for a long moment. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. "The Holloway crew is asking about the north fence timing," he said. "They want to know if we're moving it this week or—" He saw her expression. "What is it?" She held the notebook out to him. He came in and took it and read where she was pointing. He read it. He stood there with the notebook in his hand and the May morning coming through the window and the sounds of the estate coming up from outside. Jeb's voice, the sound of tools, a horse in the yard. And he looked at those words for a long time. Then he looked at her. "A version of me that could be moved," he said. "Yes," she said. "And did you find one?" She looked at him steadily. "I found something different," she said. "I found a version that moved himself." He held her gaze. "I want you to keep that," he said. He handed the notebook back. "Keep it and look at it sometimes. Not as a confession. As evidence." "Evidence of what?" "That people aren't fixed," he said. "That a version of me that existed in a plan written 3 years ago is not the same as the man standing here." He paused. "And that a woman who wrote that plan has also become someone that plan didn't account for." She looked at the notebook, then at him. "I didn't plan for you to be good," she said. "I wasn't," he said. "I'm working on it." "You're further along than you think." "You're the hardest standard I've ever tried to meet," he said, "which is the most useful thing that has ever happened to me." She put the notebook in the drawer and closed it. "The north fence," she said. "This week," he said. "This week," she agreed. They went downstairs together, and the May morning was full of work and light and the specific busy aliveness of a functioning place that has found its right shape. And Elizabeth Whitmore, Carter, still, always, and Whitmore now too, both names, both histories, both truths held together, walked out into it beside the man she had chosen for wrong reasons, and had found, on the other side of all the right work, was the right choice. By the summer of 1818, the county had stopped calling her the woman behind the veil, not because they had been asked to, not because she had corrected anyone, or managed the narrative, or built another strategic layer of reputation management. Simply because there was nothing left to speculate about. Elizabeth Whitmore was visible, in the fields, in the county business dealings, in the Friday dinners that had become something the neighboring families heard about and occasionally found themselves attending. She was exactly what she was, and what she was needed no veil and no rumor and no protection. She was a woman who had built something real. She was a woman who had made something broken into something whole. She was a woman who had carried a long grief to its proper destination, set it down with both hands, and turned to face what was ahead. And Nathaniel Whitmore, the man who had stood at an altar believing he was purchasing a solution to a problem, and who had discovered instead the most important reckoning of his life, stood beside her in the summer of 1818 on the same south fence line where he had first truly seen what she was building. And he looked at the fields that were the best they had been in 20 years. And he looked at his wife, and he understood with the full, uncomplicated certainty of a man who has finally arrived somewhere worth arriving, that the life he was living was not the life he had planned. It was better. It was the life that had required him to become someone worth living it, and he had done that work, and it had cost him the comfortable distance he had kept between himself and everything that mattered, and he would not have it back for anything in the world. Some people are defined by the wounds given to them by others. Some people are defined by the wounds they carry long enough and honestly enough to finally understand what they were for. Elizabeth Carter had carried her wound for 10 years and had built a world from it. Nathaniel Whitmore had carried his ignorance for 35 years and had finally, at the cost of everything he thought he was, put it down. Together, they had built something that neither plan, nor grief, nor the indifference of powerful men had been able to prevent. Something honest, something earned, something that would last longer than any of them, because it was built on truth. And truth, as Thomas Carter had believed, and his daughter had proven, and a changed man had finally come to understand, eventually wins. Every single time.